On a night illuminated by a large full moon, someone says they're just going to have a drink. We fear two people sitting at a table, about to have a drink. The old man says he's been waiting for this moment for decades, but even so, that man just wants a drink. He really is a heartless person. And that old man's name is Hyung, while the man in front of him doesn't even have an expression on his face. Hyung says that when they both met, they were young, but we see that the other didn't even react. Hyung thinks it's been 40 years since he met this man. In a flashback, we see that he came here to use the regression technique to go back in time. We see a much younger Hyung, shocked by this. Someone who wanted to use the regression technique, one of the greatest achievements of the Guy family, which is the Ranga clan, a technique that required centuries and centuries of research, almost impossible to use. He could have completed it, but he had no choice but to give up. The 5 materials needed to finish the technique were impossible to collect, and Ryong has already told him that he will only do this technique if he brings the materials. The Thunder Bell, a sacred artifact of the Heavenly Wind cult. The Divine Incense Brazil, a sacred artifact of the Divine Dragon family. The central essence of a 10,000-year-old carp. And the secret demon soul of the demon cult. Hyung was unable to collect 5 million Nyang. Imagine all that? But the man in front of him managed to gather all the ingredients. To obtain the last material, the secret demon soul of the demon cult, he disappeared from the world for a long time. Hyung is already saying that he thought he had died. Where the hell did he get all the ingredients? Except that the man simply takes a sip and says that he really thought that this supposed title of the great technique should be condemned to hell. He also considered the possibility of killing Hyung himself. Hyung thinks that he was very young when he first met him, but now he has become an old man whose hair is now all white, and the air around him has also changed a lot. It's inevitable that a person wouldn't go through changes looking for all these ingredients for so long, until Hyung finally asks that famous question, why exactly does he want to go back to the past? This makes the man slam his cup down, and he says that he did it all for revenge. Hyung wonders if it's really necessary to go back to the past to get revenge. Nowadays, he's not powerful enough, but the man replies that he needs to go back to the past. The old man asks him who in the world he hates so much, and he replies, Hwa Mugi. Hyung is shocked just to hear that name, and it is explained that all the leaders of the 3 strongest groups who caught the Murim died at his hands. The leader of the Moonin Alliance was killed, the leader of the Unorthodox Alliance was killed, and the Celestial Demon was also killed. The strongest person in all of history, Hwa Mug, simply the most powerful of this era. Hyung already says that he won't be able to defeat Mug, even if he goes back to the past, but the man replies that it doesn't matter. He has to kill him, no matter what. Not least because the celestial demon who died at Mug's hands was his father. But he doesn't think he's seeking revenge just because he killed his father, because he also killed the man's brother. And he thinks it's no big deal for people who have given their lives to demons to die. Rong then asks him why he's doing all this, but he replies that Mug killed all the servants, cooks, and even the children who didn't know a martial art, as well as killing all the dogs and cats in the sect. Hyung says that Mug would never do that. He can't believe it. But the man says he doesn't care whether he believes it or not. At the age he is today, he'll never be able to kill Mugi, so he needs to go back in time. He asks what would drive such a powerful person to kill a child, and Hyung sighs and asks him one thing. If he succeeds and manages to return to the past, he can do this old man a favor. Hyung says that if he goes back to the past, he must find him. The man asks what for, but Hyung says calmly, so you can stop me from getting married. There is complete silence. The man doesn't even react to this, but suddenly he starts laughing a lot, and Hyung tells him that he's not joking, that he has to stop doing that. The man says that's fine. He promises he'll do it. Then, at that moment, they go to the place where the technique will be consolidated. But the moment that man gets up, he's a bit off balance, a bit dizzy. Rong is already worried about him, but he says he's fine. It's just that he paid a very high price to get all the ingredients, especially the demonic soul. With all the necessary ingredients gathered, the last one that Hyung has already opened is the demonic soul. When all this comes together, it makes a unique aura, and he begins to recite the regression technique, using the power of all these ingredients. A glow begins to appear in the room and overshadows everything in sight until a dimensional portal appears. Even Hyung himself is shocked by what he has done. He's actually managed to perform the technique and calls that man over to see what he's done. Only we see that he is very tired and sitting down. He seems to be panting and almost losing consciousness. Rong already looks at him, looks at the portal, gets worried about the whole situation and apologizes, saying that he promised to make this portal for him, but his family is very important and he wants to go back to the past to be able to perform this technique sooner. Suddenly, he realizes that he can't move his own body. His body has been sealed by someone, and that man appears behind him and asks how Hyung could do this of all people, including him. He grabs Hyung's neck and throws him to the ground. He says he lost all rationality for a moment and apologizes profusely. He only thought he wouldn't be able to get into the portal and didn't want to waste the materials. The man calms down, takes his hand off his neck, and tells him that he's a person who cares a lot about others and about everything, having to gather all those materials. If it had been anyone else, he would have killed Hyung immediately, but he understands. As long as it's him, he thanks Hyung for waiting for him all his life. His eyes fill with tears, and that man finally smiles. Hyung has apologized from the bottom of his heart until suddenly everything goes black and white and time stops. The man wonders what's going on and suddenly sees lots and lots of butterflies. He notices that time has stopped and wonders what the hell is going on, until someone tells him that he has passed all the tests. A wise old man with a long beard appears before him. He asks who this old man is, and the wise man replies that he is the person who can send him back to the past. Humans will never understand the logic behind the divine. Does he really think that with a few materials, he'll be able to regress to the past? These ingredients are not materials to make a technique. They are tests that a person has to pass to be worthy of returning to the past, and he has passed that test. He had lived his whole life for this, sacrificed everything he had for this goal, and forgiving Hyung was his last test. And he passed. In fact, it was the hardest test, but it seems he passed it easily. The man says that if he has completed the test, he wants his wish fulfilled. Now he wants to go back to the past, but the divine being asks him what he's going to do in the past. He says that he will kill those who need to be killed and save those who need to be saved. The divine asks, so that's why you want to go back to the past. But he also says that he wants to live a meaningful life. He has lived his whole life desperately gathering all this, just to take revenge. And the divine being asks him if he regrets anything. He says he regrets everything. Everything he's done since he was born. He regrets everything. He let himself get carried away, and calamity struck. Before he knew it, his life was over. He had become just a tool to look for ingredients, until the divine being gives him a smile and says that he's very curious to know what kind of new life he's going to have, and says that he'll be watching over him in his new life. Suddenly, time moves again. He hears Hyung apologizing again, and he says that it's a bit shameless of him to say that. But if he's not to forget the promise he made, he needs to stop that wedding. The man smiles and tells old Hyung to take care. He leaves with the warning to remember what he has to do. After a flash, we see him younger, waking up. Finally, we see a place full of people. He's standing on a stage and looking at a statue. He thinks he really is, and we see lots of people cheering him on, shouting for him. He says that he has managed to return to the past, until he senses a very frightening presence. He looks at one of the important people sitting on the throne. That person stares back at him. He recognizes him as his father. His father didn't quite understand why he was being stared at by his son, but he simply gave his father a smile. Then someone asks, "Young master, how long are you going to stand there? Because they need to fight soon." And we see a very muscular man with a large sword standing in front of him. He's gone back to the past, right before the fight started, and he starts to remember what day it is. Today is the day of the tournament between the demons. It is explained that Prota's father, the celestial demon, declared that he would not limit the selection of the next cult leader to his own lineage alone. This, of course, caused a stir within the cult, because it meant that anyone could become the celestial demon in the future, as long as they were stronger. The celestial demon said that this would be very serious and announced the new demon tournament, launching a fighting competition between the next generational leaders of the cult. The winner of the new demon tournament, it would have the chance to challenge one of the heavenly demon's sons, and whoever won that fight would win a wish for the heavenly demon to fulfill. The man with the big sword tells the protagonist that he could give up while there's still time, but he doesn't let himself be shaken or react to it. The protagonist says that he remembers. At the time, he felt very offended at having been chosen, because that decision meant that he thought he was an easier target than his older brother. But actually, looking back, that wasn't the reason he was chosen. Someone had bribed the cook in his kitchen, who asked him to mix an energy-dispersing poison into the rice so that he couldn't recover his energy temporarily, and he lost the match because of this dirty trick. He told his father what had happened, but he didn't say anything. In fact, he just stared at him with eyes that seemed to blame him for having fallen for such a little trick. He did some things after that that really pushed the limit to make up for today's defeat. And because of the mistakes and failures he made, he was losing his position in the War of Succession. It all started with the day's defeat, and the guy gets pissed off that I'm facing him and says, "Second young master, are you going to stand here distracted while I'm in front of you?" Then he falls silent and asks him what his name is, and he says it's Gungu. He won't tolerate being ignored. Then the protagonist says, "Oh, it's Gungu, that's the name." It is explained that he is one of the 7 disciples of one of the 8 supreme demons, Gompa, the demon of the Bloody Sky sword, and he is the 5th disciple, Gup Yungu. The guy starts teasing Prota again, saying that a person who dares to mess with him should have skill. But the protagonist looks at his father and thinks that he didn't know that in the past, but now he does. In his father's eyes, he already knew that the protagonist was poisoned, and his father was assessing how he was going to overcome this very problematic situation. But he still has the experience of his past life. He is certainly capable of defeating Gupi Yungo with a single move, without expending any internal energy. But the problem is that he can't show his true abilities here in front of everyone. He puts his hand up and tells everyone there to listen. He says he has confidence, and in front of all his cult heroes who are gathered here today, he will defeat Gupi Yungo without using a single drop of internal energy. Everyone is shocked, impressed by this, saying that the boy has guts, and everyone begins to hail him as an incomparable swordsman. Pungu is already shocked that everyone is rooting for the protagonist now, and Pungu says that if that's how he's playing, he won't use internal energy either. Only, at that moment, everyone falls silent, because the audience didn't want to see a fight where nobody uses energy. Well, someone has to. He gets angry about this, slams his sword into the ground, and tells the second young master that even if he doesn't use internal energy, he'd better remember that Pungu's sword doesn't have eyes. It cuts anything it hits. But meanwhile, the protagonist is thinking that he feels very strange in this body, a very young body. He wonders if he'll be able to move the way he wants to, and the Pungu dares him to draw his sword. But the protagonist says he doesn't even think he needs a sword to deal with him. The people in the audience start laughing, making fun of Pungu's face, and Pungu gets angry, saying that he's not going to kill him just because he's the son of the cult leader, but that he's going to rip both his arms off, and he goes at him with ferocity. The protagonist easily dodges the first attack and thinks that this is a good thing. His body is responding well. He dodges as if he were a shadow of the next attack, and even sends the mortal backwards just to take the edge off. The protagonist thinks that his heart beats much faster at this age. Pungu is already getting nervous and wonders why he's giggling, but now it's time for the protagonist to go for it. And like the elbow to the chest, poor Pungu can't even react, and he's already hit in the nose. The protagonist pulls the blood and teeth out of his mouth and continues machine gunning him, punching him in the face, punching him in the stomach. The guy simply can't react to all this and just spits blood. When he's there, all screwed up, almost defeated, the protagonist grabs his wrist, which is holding the sword, and asks if it was that little hand that had his food poisoned. Pungu has already seen that it's going to be shit, because the protagonist takes a knee that breaks Pungu's arm completely. The protagonist is thirsty for blood. He has no mercy. Everyone is shocked by this, because Pungu can't even get up. He's crying in pain. We see that the protagonist did all this without even drawing his sword, and he thinks that now that he's back in the past, he won't let them influence how he lives his life anymore. Until suddenly, the celestial demon raises his hand. Everyone pays attention to what he has to say. He says that, as he promised, he will grant him one wish. He thinks that normally people would ask for more handicrafts or a secret martial arts manual. That's probably what everyone is expecting. But this time he's going to follow his instinct, and he says he wants to go hunting with his father. His father stares at him for a moment, shocked. The celestial demon asks his son if he just wants to go hunting with him, and the protagonist says yes. He heard that his father went hunting when he was young, so he wants to learn from the best. He faces this, gets up, and simply says that they will leave tomorrow at dawn. He gets up from his throne and leaves the place until someone says that the protagonist was an idiot. And we see that it was Pungu who said that he had won and made such a pimpish request. And the protagonist asks him what his name is, Mezamor, and he gets angry again, saying that he's going to kill him one day. But the protagonist thinks that now that he's back, the reckless life that everyone lives no longer matters to him. Later, when the sun is setting, he looks in the mirror and thinks that he really is much younger, unlike, of course, that old man he once was. And he thinks, "Humug, I wonder what he's doing now. And he thinks that if he could find Mug and kill him before he gets strong, he could solve all this easily. The problem is that he's a difficult person to find. He appears a Jangu as if he fell from the sky, and after he destroyed the Murim Alliance, the Unorthodox Alliance, and the Demon Cult, he hid in the world. So there isn't much information about him, but trying to find him by telling the whole world his name in order to find him would be a dangerous act of provocation. So in the end, his top priority is still to become stronger than Huam Mug, until someone calls out to him and says that he fought excellently today. When he hears this voice, he asks if it's Leon, and she says yes, he was right. This is his bodyguard, Leon. He remembers her. At that time, she was still alive with him. And at that same time in his past life, he didn't know that she was this huge because of a martial art she had learned. And it was all to protect him, the technique of body petrification. The user gains the ability to make their body as resistant as a rock temporarily, and it's a secret technique known only to certain people. It was taught to her. The biggest flaw of this martial art, however, is that it makes the user's body too big. He remembers that she threw herself in front of Mug's sword, and it saved his life so that he could continue. And she asks why he was looking at her like that, at which point he remembers that her voice is very sweet. She was ready to sacrifice herself for him without even thinking twice. He had Leon as essential to his life as oxygen. He slowly approaches her and thinks that she is bigger than he remembered, and she was still very curious as to why he was acting this way. He remembers her story. Leon, everyone said that she would become the greatest beauty in the world if she kept growing like that, but she, who was so beautiful, suddenly became very fat one day. That was to protect the young master. He didn't know at the time that she had cried so much because she had become so fat, and he never noticed how her eyes had swollen shut because of it. He wonders how she felt, but as expected of Leon, the bodyguard who protected him every day, she noticed the change in his mood. But he calls Leon somewhere else. He wants to show her something very strange, and she asks where they're going. He says he's going to turn the dinner table now, somewhere else, in the same sanctuary. At that moment, he was in the kitchen, and the young master simply asks, "Who did that?" The main chef asks, "What do you mean?" And he asks again who it was that poisoned his food with the energy-dissipating poison. The chef who prepared the food has already taken his out of the picture, but the young master asks if he has already lost the 3,000 niang he was paid to do this. And the protagonist thinks that this boy has run up a big debt because he has become addicted to gambling. He spent all his family's money and even borrowed money from friends. That's why he dared to do something as crazy as poison the young master's meal. He desperately gets down on his knees and asks for forgiveness. He was blinded by money and made a big mistake. He asks if it was Pungu who came to him personally to give him the money, and the chief says that it was him, yes. But then the protagonist doesn't forgive him and simply beheads the boss. The others are shocked by this, of course, and he says that it was ridiculous and shameful of him. How dare he poison the food when he cooks for everyone in the place? The older head chef says that he takes responsibility for this and apologizes to the young master. But the young master says that it's not his fault. He's not the one who poisoned the food. But the old man says that his responsibility is to look after the kitchen. Then the protagonist thinks for a while and asks, "Boss, is everything that happens in this cult the fault of his father, the great celestial demon?" The young master says no, of course not. So why is he trying to take responsibility for something he didn't do? He just tells them to stop chatting over there, be quiet, and start making his dinner straight away. He says he wants pasta with chicken because he hasn't had any for a while. The boss is shocked by this and doesn't react, but Leon asks, "Well, didn't you eat that a few days ago?" Then the protagonist looks at her, remembering that he's been back in the past. She stares at him, waiting for an answer, but he thinks that he hasn't eaten this dish in decades. At dawn the next day, in the Celestial Demon Pavilion, we see the Celestial Demon ready to go on the hunt. The father asks the protagonist what all this is he's taking. He says that it's just a few things he's taking for the next few days. The Celestial Demon says that he only intends to hunt for one day, but the young master says that maybe he'll like it and stay a little longer. The Celestial Demon says that his son has a very ambitious dream in his little head, and they walk through these high mountains. This mountain range, down in the forest, there they are. The Celestial Demon says that his son is better than he expected, and the protagonist thinks that perhaps his father has noticed the abilities he developed in his past life, so it's better to tell his father than hide it. In fact, He says that he was hiding his abilities, and his father says that he noticed. And the protagonist explains that he's not a cat that just hisses. He's an animal that's hiding its claws. His father asks why a beast would hide its claws, and the protagonist says that if you think about it that way, that's why his son is still only a cat. He also asks his son how much of the art of the flat sword he has mastered so far, and the protagonist thinks the art of the flying sword is passed down only to the bloodline of the celestial demon, and is considered an extremely advanced martial art, similar to the martial arts learned by the supreme demons. And he tells his father that he has mastered it completely. Suddenly a shot rings out right next to his face. He manages to dodge it and thinks that if he hadn't dodged it, he would surely be dead. And his father says, "Yes, you really have." And the protagonist says, "Oh, you wanted to test whether I'd really completed it by trying to kill me?" He asks what would have happened if he hadn't dodged, and his father says that he would simply have paid the price for lying to him. By mastering this technique, he would have been able to dodge it anyway, and the protagonist says that even so, his face is very pretty, like his own. After he says this, his father just stares at him, and the protagonist thinks, "Have I said too much?" But his father turns around and says that to master a technique like that at his age is truly praiseworthy, and the protagonist is impressed that his father praised him. And they continue on their way, and he says quietly, "Thank you" to his father. A little later, they stop to do the trace. His father was analyzing the evidence there, and the protagonist asks him who his father learned to hunt from. He replies that it was from his older brother, and the protagonist asks, "Well, did I ever have an uncle?" Only the celestial demon says that he killed him when the protagonist was about the same age. After saying something like that, he leaves, but the protagonist says that he was right to do so, because otherwise, he wouldn't have been born. His father just stares at him in silence, but this time, he doesn't leave, but stays put. And the protagonist thinks that even his father, the great celestial demon, would be hurt emotionally by having to fight with his own family. He's seen a lot of this in his past life. The stronger a person seems on the outside, the deeper their wounds can be. And his father says that there was no other solution at the time, and the protagonist thinks that he couldn't find a way to win the successor war without killing his own brother. And the protagonist says that he hopes his father doesn't think he can do it. He can't do what his father wasn't able to do. And his father himself knows that he doesn't even need to consider it, because his older brother is vile and cruel. The celestial demon stares at his own son as he stands in the back, thinking about what to say again, and his father simply says that he's only bad-mouthing him when he's not around, doesn't he? And a while later, still in that great mountain range, we see them climbing one of those great mountains, and the protagonist is thinking that he didn't even get married in his past life. That's why he doesn't know what it feels like to have a child. So he's very curious about this. What does a father feel about a son? And when they go upstairs, his father is waiting for him to arrive and asks him why he's looking over there. Is there something? And the father says that they have dinner, and the protagonist then says that they have to go ahead and kill it. But his father asks him how he can kill something he can't even see. First, he must close his eyes and feel his surroundings, and he obeys his father by closing his eyes. The protagonist thinks that when martial artists try to figure out their opponents, they feel the vibrations in the air around them. People usually refer to this as the energy flow of a being, but the only flow he can feel is that of his father, who is extremely aggressive. His father begins to guide him, explaining how to do this. Now, he must send out a wave of energy in a straight line, and, without breaking it, make it thinner and thinner. He must think of his body as a ball of yarn. The protagonist concentrates, striving to make this line of energy thin and uninterrupted. His father tells him that he has to discharge this energy slowly, as if he were pulling a thread from the ball of yarn. We see that the protagonist manages to make this line go in a straight line until he feels something. His father asks him if he has reached something, and the protagonist replies that yes, he can feel it. His father asks him what he thinks it is, and analyzing the vibration, the protagonist says it's a tree. His father asks him to keep looking around, very slowly. He struggles on, trying to find something with his energy, until he finally finds a creature. He says it's a wild boar, but it looks more like a bear, as its body is too long for a boar. The father assures him that it is, in fact, a wild boar. The father realizes that his son was very focused and comments that, at first, he couldn't guess correctly at that distance either. Prota, however, mentions that he was blessed with a body that learns martial arts very quickly, so it wasn't that much work for him. A little later, he is already roasting the boar to eat. His father asks him where he learned to cook animals like that, and the protagonist replies that he learned it from a book. His father comments that he seems very skilled, since he's never done it before. The protagonist is flattered by his father's words, but thinks that he has actually done this countless times in his past life. The protagonist tells his father that he also prepared the rug on which he is sitting, just to earn a little of his gratitude, and that it was worth carrying all that baggage. The father asks if he wanted to hunt with him all this time, just to impress him and become his successor. The protagonist replies that no, that doesn't work with his father, because he will become the successor with his own power. The father then comments that he has a lot of confidence in his words, and asks why he wanted to hunt with the celestial demon. The protagonist says that he has two reasons. The first is to learn the techniques from his own father, in order to become more powerful, and it seems that he has already succeeded in this. His father asks him what comes after he gets stronger. The protagonist replies that his father must have misunderstood. He doesn't want to get stronger to become the celestial demon. His father is still healthy and strong, and he doesn't want to waste his youth trying to become like his father. He thinks he will be satisfied if he can learn the martial arts of the celestial demon, becoming a successor, but reflects that he needs to learn the demon art of the 9 calamities quickly and master it. In fact, he has to become even more powerful because, after all, his father, who mastered this technique, died at the hands of Mug. He needs to become strong beyond comprehension. The father asks what the second reason is. Seeing that his father is curious, the protagonist gives a little smile and says that he also wanted to spend some time with him. After all, it's the first time they've done this together. His father gives a slight smile and comments that this feeling is useless and that one day it will kill him. The protagonist asks what he means by useless, as he is spending time with the strongest person he knows. If his father sings a song, it will be the best in the world. And if he drinks a liqueur, it will be the best liqueur in the world. The father reflects, looks away, and the protagonist begins to reflect too. He thinks that whenever he tries to remember his father, he has no memory of him. After all, fear doesn't count as a memory. And in this life, he doesn't want to have only that kind of memory. This is not for his father's sake, but for his own. When it's morning again, the protagonist says it's time to go back. However, his father replies that he's not going anywhere. He's gone hunting with the celestial demon, so he has to come home with at least the body of a tiger. The protagonist is confused. What do you mean? Swing and his father tells him not to stand there like an idiot and to follow him. The protagonist obeys, and they walk to a bamboo grove. The father tells him to close his eyes again. The target this time is 100 leagues away, much further than the last prey. The father guides his son, teaching him how to infuse the wind with energy. The protagonist thinks that in all the time he has spent learning martial arts, he never imagined that he could infuse energy into the wind. No one has ever taught him this, and none of the arts he learned in books or scrolls mentioned anything of the sort. His father guides him to discharge this energy. Again, the protagonist creates that little line of internal energy, but his father tells him that if he's too slow and careful, all he'll get is a cheap trick. If he wants to use this in a real situation, he needs to send his energy to the target as quickly as possible. The protagonist squeezes his eyes shut and concentrates. His energy line now seems much thicker and denser than before, and he feels he can perceive the wind with his energy. But how to combine the two? He realizes that it's not just passing energy through the wind. He needs to intertwine them, as if they were two strands of the same ball of yarn. Now, his much faster line is hunting for the next prey. The energy passes through the bamboo grove like lightning, until it finally finds a tiger. Prota, shocked, confirms that it really is a tiger, and asks his father what's wrong. His father tells him not to be lazy during his training. No, the more power lines he can maintain, the better his chances of surviving in a real situation. The protagonist says he'll keep that in mind. A little later, they're already stopping for a drink, and the protagonist comments that this is his most powerful asset. The father takes a sip of the drink and comments that it's actually very good. The protagonist replies that it's too strong for him, but he's only disguising it because he thinks it's a big lie. His father then says that a demonic human would never say that a drink was too strong. The protagonist replies, "So what? If I can't drink, having a depraved heart is much more important to a demon than drinking a strong drink." The father asks, "Depraved heart? You?" And then asks his son if he would kill him there so that he could survive. The protagonist replies that, of course he wouldn't. How could a child kill his own father? But inside, he thinks that this is also a lie. If he had enough motive, he could kill his father. This is the first time he has a proper conversation with his father. And then he asks again, "How could I kill you?" The father replies that if he's in doubt, then he doesn't have a depraved heart, as he says. Prota then jokes that he's going to have to learn to drink a stiff drink and takes another sip. His father watches thoughtfully. In the evening, back at the sect, the protagonist is meditating to cultivate his power. He's tired, but happy with his progress. He thinks that, after a few days of training since his regression, he is now able to freely infuse his energy into the wind, as well as maintain 3 or 4 lines of energy at the same time. He hadn't expected his father to teach him how to discharge energy to check his surroundings. What he's just mastered is practically an extra life, because he can see where the enemy is and where he's going to attack from. If he keeps training and manages to release more than 10 lines at the same time, he might be able to neutralize any stealth techniques used by his enemies. He gets excited, but soon calms down, thinking that even his father, the most powerful person he knows, was defeated by Mug. That's because the Celestial Pavilion has been infiltrated. A little is then explained about the Celestial Demon Pavilion, a place completely protected by 3 barrier formations, 6 trap formations, and a carefully selected elite group. There are also 8 supreme demons in 8 different directions, with their subordinates protecting the heavenly demon. In the north, there are the demonic swordsmen of the Northern Heaven Sword family, led by the supreme one-hit sword. In the south, there are the demonic swordsmen of the Southern Heaven Sword family, led by the Bloody Heaven Sword swordsman. In the east, there are the Iron Fists of the Eastern Fist faction, led by the demon of the Undefeated Fist. In the west are the demonic sorcerers of the Western Illusion formation, led by the Soul-Stealing demon. In the northeast are the Faceless Swordsmen, whose goal is to become the Smiling demon. In the southeast are the Drunken Swordsmen, always accompanied by the Drunken demon. In the southwest are the Poison Fangs, who research all kinds of poison, led by the Poison King. Finally, in the northwest, there are the Mad Monks, hallucinated by their belief in the demonic Buddha of deceiving the world. The protagonist thinks that, at the time, he believed that the enemy had invaded from outside. However, he later realized that the external defense was never breached. He is sure that someone among the 8 supreme demons allowed Mug to enter the Heavenly Demon Pavilion, where his father was. The traitor has never been found, and there may be more than one. For him, it doesn't matter anymore. From that moment on, he will treat any of the 8 supreme demons as traitors. After the Celestial Demon, their father, died, none of the 8 supreme demons sought revenge. Instead, they decided to close down the demon cult. This is still an event in the distant future, but he knows everything about the 8 supreme demons, how they lived, and what their last moments of life were. He leaves where he was, walking slowly, thinking that this time, he will use the 8 supreme demons to his advantage. Then he stops in front of a door and hears someone talking on the other side. Someone asks, "Hey fatty, is the master still training?" We see that it's a bald man asking how many days he's going to stay inside, and if he doesn't leave, he's going to drag him out. She gets angry, asking what he said, but the protagonist comes out and asks Leon what's going on in there. The bald man is shocked to see the young master. The protagonist says, "Ah, Leon, I told you you could get out of here while I was training. Did you really wait here for me?" The bald man approaches and says, "Ah, good of you to leave, young master. Why have you been training so hard lately, eh?" The protagonist thinks that this guy is one of the Bloody Sky Sword's disciples, Yang Po, and reflects that the reason he acts so boldly is entirely down to the Celestial Demon, since he announced that anyone could become his successor. Being the son of the Heavenly Demon no longer seems so special. In fact, this has fueled many ambitious desires within the cult, especially to defeat the sons of the Celestial Demon in order to gain notoriety. The protagonist asks what the bald man wants, and he mentions Pill, the guy who broke the protagonist's arm, and who can no longer practice martial arts. The protagonist replies, "Yeah, so what? What do you want me to do? Go and give him some soup." The bald man asks if the protagonist is joking, but the protagonist replies that he's not close enough to him to talk about that kind of thing. The bald man then says that the protagonist needs to officially apologize to Pill. The protagonist understands that the bald man is doing this because the best disciple of the Sword of the Bloody Sky has not yet been selected. That's why the disciples are trying to impress him. Yang Po wants the protagonist to apologize in order to gain notoriety in his own cult. Prota then comments that he doesn't think his master will choose him as the best disciple if he does that. The bald man, however, replies that this is nonsense. He's there to help his friend, but the protagonist says that's enough small talk. Now the protagonist wants the bald man to apologize to him. Young Po asks, "For what?" And the protagonist replies that it's because he was rude to his subordinate, and that, at this point, he has to apologize to her. Obviously, the guy didn't feel like doing it, and Leon says it's fine, but for the protagonist, it's not fine. Leon doesn't even object. She turns red. The protagonist approaches Jung Po and says that since he was rude to his subordinate, he should kneel down and apologize now. Jung Po asks him if he wants him to kneel in front of the fat girl. The protagonist replies again, "Being rude, aren't you?" Jung Po says that the protagonist is crazy, that he would rather die than kneel in front of her. The protagonist replies, "Oh, you'd rather die?" That was all he needed to hear. He's going to make sure he gets his wish. The protagonist slowly draws his sword, and the bald man is already in shock. Leon too, but in a more pleasant way. Jung Po says that the protagonist is going crazy, but the protagonist continues, "Kneel down and apologize, or you die. It's your choice." The protagonist knows very well that Jung Po's master won't be happy to hear that he's backed down from a fight. The bald man asks why the protagonist is going that far. The protagonist replies that he doesn't care if he was there to look for him, that he can understand this group revenge, but he won't allow him to insult his subordinate. Jung Po starts laughing and actually asks him if he's going to kill him because of that little pig he's protecting. The protagonist says that she means a lot to him and that he would kill her without thinking twice. The bald man feels provoked and also draws his sword. The staff warn that the situation is going to be problematic. Leon tries to stop his master, but they are both ready to fight. Jung Po says that the protagonist could even be the son of the celestial demon, so he wouldn't kill him, he'd just rip his arms off. But the protagonist doesn't even react to this. While the people around them are nervous about the start of the fight, the atmosphere falls into a heavy silence, the calm before the storm. Jung Po goes on the attack, but misses. With a single blow, the protagonist goes through Jung Po's head, driving the blade into his mouth. The people on Jung Po's side are shocked. So is Leon, who turns red at what has happened. The protagonist says that it was Jung Po's mouth that caused his death. He used that mouth to insult the subordinate of the son of the celestial demon, and it was the same mouth that refused to apologize. At that moment, he removes the blade, along with all the blood that was on Jung Po's head. He simply falls over dead, while the protagonist stares at the lifeless body with lifeless eyes. The people who were with Jung Po run around worried, saying that there will be consequences for what the young master has done. The protagonist replies that their mouths look like those of the guy who has just died, and asks them to repeat his words exactly as he said them. If anyone dares to change anything, they will meet the protagonist at dusk. Then they carry Jung Po's body away, and Leon asks why he did it. She wonders if he did it for someone like her, who is only a subordinate. The protagonist thinks that Leon was very worried about him, even though she was the one who was insulted at the time. He replies that he didn't do it exactly because of her, that he only killed someone who deserved to die. But Leon comments that he will probably have problems with the leader of the Bloody Sky. The protagonist reflects that it's understandable that Leon is frightened by this situation. After all, the 8 martial masters of the demon cult have great influence, martial prowess, and subordinates that not even his father could ignore. The Bloody Sky Swordsman is one of the 8 supreme demons, and the protagonist broke the arm of one of them, preventing him from practicing martial arts, and has now just killed another. Even so, the protagonist replies to Leon, saying that the master won't do anything, because he won't gain anything by getting involved in this story. He would certainly be criticized for not having taught his disciples the way he should have. Leon comments that the master's pride may have been hurt, but the protagonist says that he has no such pride. He goes on to say that Leon doesn't need to worry about him either. Again, she is embarrassed, looking at him slowly. The protagonist thinks that, contrary to what he said, he will gain something by killing that guy. He smashed fist in a fight, and now he's killed Jung Po. This will attract the attention of everyone in the cult. If the War of Succession is scored on points, he's just won one. Suddenly, Leon starts thanking him for what he's done. She was very happy that he had stood by her, and that means a lot to her, from the bottom of her heart. The protagonist gives her a little smile and says that she'd better not just be grateful, that she can't forget this for the rest of her life. Leon replies, "All right, young master." But deep down, the protagonist didn't care that much. He just wanted Leon to keep smiling. He wants her to live her life smiling like that. Later, with the big full moon in the sky, in the garden of the pavilion, the celestial demon was silent for the moment, and the protagonist thinks that he didn't want to answer at the time. He says now, in the present, that he doesn't trust anyone, not even the supreme demons. He goes on to say that his son said that hierarchy and discipline need to be organized within this cult. His father doesn't want to hear the, "oh, have to get rid of corruption" kind of crap. He wants to hear what his son really thinks should be done in the cult. They stare at each other for a moment, and the protagonist says that he feels as if, somewhere along the way, they have lost the true path of a demon. His father is shocked by these words and actually asks, "Has this lost the demonic way?" He asks his son what the demon way means to him, and the protagonist says that he believes the demon way is the belief that only their cult has to defeat absolute evil. His father keeps asking him about absolute evil, and he says that he doesn't think the Orthodox faction is the opposite of his cult. His father asks, "What is it then?" He says that their opposite is absolute evil. He's referring to the absolute evil that is so cowardly and evil that no human in the world can bear it, an evil that even demons despise and turn away from. He says that the Orthodox faction deals with lesser evils, but he doesn't think they are capable of dealing with absolute evil. After all, the Orthodox faction always forgives people, and while they value people, how can they be competent for an evil that has abandoned its humanity and is running around loose? The protagonist says that they are the only existence within the MM that can get rid of the evil that is atrocious and perverse, being even more perverse than he is. When this great evil that the Orthodox faction can't deal with kneels before them, that's when they'll really complete the demon's path. And if they can't even follow the true path of the devil, they can't go that far. And if they can't, they must punish themselves so that they can survive. The celestial demon is a little taken aback after hearing all this, and the protagonist thinks that he's sure his father never thought of it before, nor ever heard of anything like it, because he didn't learn it or realize it while he was in this cult. He realized it while wandering the Central Plains throughout his past life. His father simply asks him if he has any other arrogant thoughts to share with him, but the protagonist says no, that's enough. His father says that now he might know why the demon of the bleeding sword of heaven wants him to punish his own son. He wants to use him as a test. The protagonist says that perhaps he saw the chance to be a candidate for successor, but the father says that perhaps he saw the protagonist as a person who could mess up the cult. The protagonist says that, whatever the reason, that old man certainly has a good eye for the extraordinary. His father thinks about it for a moment, but then tells him to follow him somewhere else. The protagonist asks where they're going so late at night, and they go to the Lesser Divine Cave, which are stone gates on a small mountain. The protagonist thinks that the Lesser Divine Cave is a place where a possible candidate who could become the celestial demon, a disciple of the celestial demon, or a son of the celestial demon, will be tested. Getting in is easy, but if they can't pass the tests, then they'll be trapped forever. The chance of success is 50-50. Half the people who have a blood connection to the celestial demon who enter have lost their lives. This place is so dangerous that even Prota's brother, who is extremely ambitious, didn't even mention that he wanted to enter. But this is a place he must pass at least once if he wants to become the celestial demon. The protagonist asks if his father really wants him to go in there, but his father replies that he went in at about the age the protagonist is now. He asks how long it took his father to get out of there, and the celestial demon replies that it took him 2 months. The protagonist thinks that his father is the celestial demon with the greatest martial arts skills in all of history, and yet it took him 2 months to get out. The celestial demon goes on to say that he was the only one to manage this feat. The other celestial demons took an average of 3 years. The protagonist asks if he really wants him to enter without any preparation. This is the punishment he's been thinking about all this time. Then they face each other, both remain silent, and the protagonist thinks that his father is sending him to a place where he will probably die just because the swordsman from the bloody sky wants him to be punished. Either he really doesn't care about his son, or he really wants the protagonist to get stronger and survive. The protagonist gives a little smile and says that since this moment has arrived, he didn't want to say anything, but he'll get out quicker than his father. The celestial demon smiles too, and tells him to try and get out alive. So he enters this place that looks like a very quiet temple, and thinks how terrible this place must be for people to take so long to leave, until he sees a long corridor and walks towards the end of it, until he sees a stone with writing on it. It has 3 topics on it: defeat all your enemies without using the sword aura or enhanced sword aura. If you don't succeed within the time limit, you'll only get another chance 10 days later, and those who are ready stay inside the Crimson Circle. And the protagonist is thinking, 10 days? What do you mean? Until in the corner, he sees several pots with balls of beans, like soybeans, and he wonders if he has to eat them. He thinks he has no intention of wasting any more time there, and enters the red circle. Suddenly, several training dummies appear. They are all the same, but they all have a red stripe on a different part of their body. The protagonist thinks, obviously it looks like I have to cut exactly where the red marks are. He starts by cutting off the first 2, until he gets the hang of it and starts cutting off several of the mannequins. He slices into each of them without even thinking about it until, at one point, he gets a little tired and thinks they're tougher than he thought. At the time, There was one who was leaving, and the protagonist went running, thinking he couldn't let him come back. At the last second, he manages to make a cut, but by then, there were 3 others who were also trying to leave. He quickly manages to cut them off too, but at the end there was one last one who was about to leave. He thinks that's the last one, and the mannequin slowly sinks into that hole, but the protagonist quickly manages to decapitate the mannequin. The protagonist thinks that he almost spent another 10 days in this place just because of an oversight, and he thinks that if it were in his past life, at this point where he is now, he would never have been able to do it. Until at the door, he sees another stone written on it, and the people here marked how many attempts they managed to get past it. One person passed with 9 attempts, another with 16, another with 37, and one didn't even know if he'd make it home, until one managed to complete it in 6 attempts, the most powerful so far. But the protagonist sees that none of them is his father, until he sees something written and identifies it. It's clearly his father, and it just says, "Idiots." The protagonist can't believe he sent this to his ancestors, until he reaches the next room, and again, there is that same crimson circle on the floor. The protagonist realizes that in this room, there are different types of weapons, and probably, to do this test, he has to pick one of them up. The first rule is, use the swords hanging on the wall to break the stone in half in 2 hours. He can't use sword aura, or enhanced sword aura. Rule number 2, if you don't succeed within the time limit, you'll only get another chance 20 days later. Rule 3, those who are ready must enter the crimson circle, and the protagonist enters without even thinking about it, until the altar appears in front of him with a perfectly spherical stone. The protagonist thinks that he has 2 hours to cut a simple ball, and thinks that if he used his aura, he could cut hundreds and hundreds in 2 hours. So there must be a reason for the instructions. He picks up one of the swords on the wall, but when he hits the stone, it simply breaks the blade. The protagonist thinks that trying to cut it that way might not work. Then he thinks he'll use his aura and run quickly to the next challenge, but he pulls back just as he's about to do it and says that it would be too easy if he did it that way. He wonders how others have done it and goes again to see other people's accounts. The first said that he succeeded with 1 attempt using the enhanced sword aura. The second tried 89 times to cut without the aura, but failed and used the aura to cut. One person said he managed to cut without the enhanced sword aura, and the person below didn't believe the one above. The next person wondered how they would do it without sword aura, and the next person said that the person who said they cut without aura was lying. The person below agreed, but the protagonist keeps looking for his father until there's a comment saying that this is completely nonsense. If there's heat on the blade, he loses. The protagonist wonders what this means until someone else says that he can use the sword aura, but the protagonist interprets this as, it's written that you can use it, not that you should. And the protagonist then thinks that this test has to be passed without using the aura. It was probably a message his father left to warn him, because heat is generated when you use an enhanced sword aura. So the protagonist picks up another sword, breaks it on the stone, picks up an axe and breaks it on the stone, picks up a sledgehammer and breaks it on the stone. He gets extremely tired trying to break this stone. He thinks he's done all this and hasn't got a scratch on it. How is he going to cut it in half? He thinks that his time is almost up and considers using the sword aura as well, but calms down a bit and thinks that his father managed it without using the aura. Then he remembers his father and thinks it might be his technique. Then he begins to feel the energy around him. That line of energy slowly moves towards the spherical stone and penetrates its material to analyze it. The protagonist realizes something. There really is a weak line in that ball. Now he can see exactly where he needs to cut. He picks up the sword and continues to feel as he gets closer. And he thinks that it's not an illusion. Really, that weak line in the middle is exactly enough to cut it in half. Then, having made this conclusion, he makes the cut and actually manages to split it in 2, and he thinks he's finally done it. But when he looked inside that cut, there was another little ball, and looking closely, he sees that it's a demonic essence pill. If the demonic human who has learned demonic martial arts consumes this pill, then he will be able to obtain a tremendous amount of energy. The protagonist thinks that if he had cut with his sword aura, this pill would have exploded with the heat, and he thinks that this is the reward for cutting only with the sword. He thanks his father's warning that he couldn't use heat. Before going on to the next challenge, he sits down to meditate, and it seems that, at this moment, he is absorbing the energy from the pill. We see a great demonic aura around him, until he finally manages to extract this energy and opens his eyes. At that moment, he feels much stronger. He can feel the power flowing through his body like never before. The thing he needed most since returning to the past was energy, and now he's got it. The next challenge also has 3 rules. The first is to differentiate between life and death. The second, that if he fails, he will have another chance 5 days later, and the same thing. Whoever is ready enter the Crimson Circle. The protagonist wonders what kind of challenge this will be, but of course he enters the circle. Suddenly, a large board appears in front of him, each with bouquets of flowers, twigs, and that sort of thing. The protagonist thinks that the challenge is to differentiate between herbs and poisonous plants. The protagonist has already searched a lot for this kind of thing, some ingredients that Hyung had already asked him for, so he knows how to differentiate all kinds of herbs from poisonous plants and their effects. This will be easy for him. Then he takes the first herb and says, "It's just a herb, it's not poisonous." But all of a sudden, the sign goes down, and the protagonist thinks it's a challenge system so that you don't win by chance. In other words, you need a second test. The person who really understands this kind of thing has to taste the weed they've picked up. And, after a while, he was already selecting the last one. The tablet returns to the floor, and the protagonist thinks that it's not coming back. Perhaps it's finished and gone to the next room. He sees everyone's reports. The first said he was going to become a poisonous human soon. The second said this test was ridiculous, because a celestial demon doesn't have to know this kind of thing. The third said he must have a clue, so he was going to do more research. The fourth said he succeeded on his 96th try. His father said that he lost a lot of hair eating that much poison, but his father simply wrote not to count on luck. The protagonist thinks that when his father said that, it meant that he remembered everything he'd eaten since the first test, and he thinks that, luckily, they managed to keep their hair intact. And the next was the last challenge, surviving the illusory trap of life and death. The second rule says that if he dies here, he really dies. And the third rule, if he's ready, enter the Crimson Circle. The protagonist thinks it's the first challenge in which you die in failure, the first entry from the people who took part. The guy said that if he became a celestial demon one day, he would find the person who did it here and kill them. The second said it was really scary and difficult. The third person said that he will never again step into an illusory trap of life and death. His father said not to rest. And Prota, entering the circle, thinks that his father left a hint this time too. The protagonist thinks that this hint wasn't for the game, it was for his life. Suddenly the surroundings change and he enters the illusion. He's in a barren field with no life whatsoever. It looks like a desert. There are some marshmallows, some sand, and the protagonist picks up the sand and thinks it looks very real. The protagonist couldn't believe that an illusory trap could make all this real. But suddenly he realizes that he is surrounded by undead warriors, and the protagonist thinks that, although they are only illusions, he can sense their every presence, even their intent to kill. This really is a great opportunity for him, and he draws his sword and prepares for combat. As soon as he draws his sword, the zombies all come at him. The protagonist is even caught off guard by their speed. One of the attacks almost hits him, but luckily he manages to dodge it and completely punctures the zombie's skull. The next ones, he dodges in the same way and jumps over the entire order of zombies. He thinks that since he's not dealing with humans this time, he'll embed his sword with his aura. He thinks that, since they're not human, he can fight without any hesitation and makes a big cut with his aura. He thinks that, thanks to the pill he used, he can use his energy freely, but the zombies didn't seem to want to give up. And when they all leapt towards him, he took a deep breath and concentrated his energy as the attacks approached him. With a single movement, all the zombies are hit by very fine cuts, and these cuts begin to split their bodies. The protagonist carries out a complete massacre of these zombies, blood everywhere, corpses falling to the ground. And when he looks back, he's even scared because he realizes it's over. He thinks it'll be a shame if that's all there is to it, until he hears more noises in the background, gives a little smile, and thinks that it really isn't over yet. And we see another undead battle approaching. But even with another battalion, our protagonist is still killing. Only this time, he has to dodge arrows as well. He was getting tired, but he wasn't weak because he could still dodge the attacks. But he remembers his father's advice, don't rest. And he continues to kill the undead one by one. The protagonist thinks that this is the first real battle he's had since he came back in the past. And for him, who fought continuously in his past life, it seems like he's seen it all. What he learned in his past life is coming together with his current body. Suddenly, several arrows are shot in his direction, but he spins his sword to dodge them all and return one to the zombie. He thinks that they can come as many as they want. Stronger, faster, it doesn't matter because he keeps cutting them all until he finally cuts the last zombie's skull in half. When he puts his sword away, He gasps a little and wonders if it's finally over. The illusion fades, and one of the inscriptions congratulates him on having completed it and hopes that this force will be the future of the demonic sect. The protagonist thinks that he has finally succeeded in just one day, whereas it took his father a whole month. But he thinks that if people found out about it in the cult, it would cause a stir. If people knew he'd done it quickly like that, they'd doubt him more than appreciate him. He thinks he's going to stay here and continue his training, because he's already learned everything he's supposed to learn in here. Now, he's going to refine it. 100 days later, he appears before his father. The protagonist says that he tried his best, but didn't break his father's record. It's clearly a lie, and the first thing his father asks him is whether he cut the stone in half the right way. He says yes, after all. Someone gave him a very good tip, and he didn't rest on the last challenge either, until his father gives him a little smile. Then the protagonist notices and thinks, hey, did my dad smile? Did I see something wrong? The father says that at least his son isn't an idiot, and he replies that of course not. After all, he is the son of the great celestial demon. Then his father sighs, and the protagonist thinks that before he returned, he thought he enjoyed pitting his sons against each other in a life and death struggle to become the successor. But he thinks he understands his father now. He is a person who is willing to endure the death of his children if it were for the good of the cult. Now, the protagonist is sure that his father is not someone who simply enjoys watching others fight. Until one person says, here's thinking that if the second master did it in 100 days, that's a really impressive milestone. The protagonist thinks that the person who said this is the cult's second in command, the person his father trusts the most, Chief Consultant Sima Mung. The protagonist bows and thanks him. The advisor says that it's a good thing he even saw Prota, because he needs to talk to him about something. The protagonist wonders, what about me? He wonders if the counselor wants to discuss something about the cult. Perhaps it means that his father wants him to do it. The advisor says that they received an anonymous letter recently, which mentioned that corruption was going on within the demon army. The protagonist becomes a little reflective about this. He thinks that the demon army is one of the cult's groups, and that the leader of this army is supposed to be the blood brother of the Swordsman of the Bloody Sky. The protagonist wonders if that old man is involved in all this again. The advisor goes on to say that last year they also received this letter, but they carried out a separate investigation and it ended in failure because the special investigation officer was killed. The protagonist asks if he was killed by the demonic army. The advisor says yes, and the person who killed the investigator committed suicide shortly afterwards. The advisor gets straight to the point and says that he wants the protagonist to be a special investigator for this and to take care of this matter personally. The protagonist obviously thinks that this is very dangerous. Anyone found to be complicit in corruption will be executed, and anyone involved in corruption will do everything they can to hide their own crimes. Even if the investigator is the son of the heavenly demon, they won't take it easy on Prada. The protagonist says that the advisor is sending him on a suicide mission. The counselor says it's true. He has to put his life at risk to carry out this mission. The protagonist thinks it must be another one of his father's tests. The celestial demon asks his son if he didn't say one day that he could control people. He says yes, but when he becomes the celestial demon, the father then says that he's afraid. The protagonist says that if he puts it that way, he won't be able to refuse. He gets the message and says he'll accept the mission. He thinks he doesn't know what his father is planning, but he's going to give a good performance. The protagonist says, oh, by the way, these could be my last moments of life. You don't want to go out for a drink, do you? But his father just walks off and ignores him. The protagonist says that he seems tough, but he really cares about the people. But the counselor says he's never thought of it that way. And the next morning, we see a hunchback still meeting Prota, and he introduces himself as Seo Darong. He's from the Nirvana Pavilion, and is part of the Special Investigation Office. Here is the text with the punctuation corrected. And the protagonist asks what Darong is doing there, because he told the counselor that he wanted to see the prettiest girl in the Nirvana Pavilion. Darong says that he seems to be the prettiest girl in the advisor's eyes. The protagonist is a little stressed by this response, but says that they have to get to work soon. Darong asks, hey, are you going out already? And the protagonist says yes. The protagonist asks what kind of person the commander of the demon army is, and Darong starts to explain everything, saying that the commander of the demon army is called Gu Xiang, and he is the younger brother of Gu Chompa, the demon of the Bloody Sky Sword. And this year is the 8th year that he has commanded the demon army. As the demon army has taken on various dangerous missions, he has raised the level, where everyone recognizes the army as an elite one. The protagonist then says that he's doing a good job, but suddenly he stops and faces Durong. He asks what it is, and the protagonist asks if he really wants to investigate it with him. Durong says yes, he does, but the protagonist asks why he's looking and walking like that. He can't feel any enthusiasm when he says it, but he says it's because if they reveal the corruption, nothing will change. The protagonist thinks that the guy is saying that if the cult executives don't change, the cult won't change, and he reflects that maybe it's true. He asks Durong if he's not scared, and he says no. The protagonist asks, not really? Even if the last investigator died? Durong completely shocks Prota, replying that his last personal investigator was the person who looked after him, the person who led him, and who taught him everything he knows today. The protagonist is a little embarrassed now that he's been saying all this to the guy, and we see his sad face. A little while later, at the Dragon's Demon Court, the guard asks where this guy is from, and Durong takes over and tells him that he's a special investigator for the Nirvana Pavilion, and asks the guy to back off, as he has business with the army commander. The protagonist thinks this guy has guts. The first guard says that if he's a special investigator, he doesn't seem so special. The other says he can't go up without permission. Then Durong takes out a piece of paper and says, here's the order document. The bald guard tells him to wait, that he's going to report it to his superior, but Durong says that there's no way because he's going to meet his superior, so they're going in now. But the guy keeps saying that he can't go in without permission. Durong actually asks if the guard is stopping the special investigator with his document, but the bald man says it's nothing. Special investigator or not, here he follows the rules. Durong gets angry when he says this, and the other says that the title of special investigator doesn't mean anything. He's a bit nervous and doesn't know what to say, but the protagonist approaches him and asks if they know who he is. The guards, a little nervous, reply that they know. The protagonist asks, oh, you know? And yet, knowing my identity, you continue to say this kind of thing and be rude and disrespectful. Durong is shocked when the protagonist does this, but the protagonist tells them to get on with it. When they enter, we see a group of people who don't look very handsome or well-groomed. Durong takes the document and tells everyone to get out of the way because there's a special investigation going on right now, and asks if everyone there wants to end up in prison. The people start laughing. Nobody takes him seriously. A guy at the back asks who these people are, who have come to make a fuss, and he says he's Special Investigator Durong, and asks the bald man to reveal his identity. He introduces himself as Goong, the captain of the demon army's first platoon. Durong whispers to the protagonist about this guy, saying that he is the second in command, but is notorious for doing horrible things. Durong scolds him and tells him that he is a special investigator from the Nirvana Pavilion who is doing his job, but Goong asks what he will do if he doesn't comply. Durong says that everyone there will be arrested for interrupting the investigation. Godan asks, arrested? And he and the others start laughing at Durong. He says, wow, I'm so scared. I want to see you try that. Then the protagonist appears and says that he hasn't seen the captain for a long time. He says that maybe the last time was at that banquet, wasn't it? But when the protagonist shakes his hand, he pushes too hard, and Goong feels the pressure. The protagonist calmly says that they have come to take care of some urgent business and need to see the commander of the demon army. If he dares stand in the way, he'll lose that hand forever. But Godan says that there are some people who think that swords don't work against them just because they were born noble. The protagonist asks if he can pick up a sword now with his little hand, and Godan bets on which will fall first, his sword or his intestines. But after a while, he gets out of the way, and the protagonist thanks him for getting out of the way and says he'll buy him a drink next time. As they continue, Durong asks if the protagonist has met Goong before, but he says no, he met him for the first time today. Durong then asks why he went off the path, and the protagonist tells him that he broke his hand on purpose and says that he'll have to eat with one hand for a while. Durong is shocked by this, but the protagonist tells him that he'd better stop going straight away. Durong says, oh, yes, of course, but informs him that the army commander's office is on the 7th floor, so it'll be a while yet. But the office guards also say the same thing. They can't meet him unless they have an appointment. The protagonist is already stressed by this and tells them to get out of the way because it's a special investigation. Then he takes the sheet of paper and puts it in the guard's face, saying that trying to stop him with this document in hand is the same as trying to stop the cult leader. The guards are obviously shocked, and the protagonist says that he may be underestimating them, but he can't ignore this document, not least because it was the cult leader himself who signed it, until someone says to let the second young master in, and that person is the commander himself, who welcomes the son of the cult leader. He says that perhaps his men have been rude to the protagonist, and that they're a bit ignorant, so it's understandable, isn't it? The protagonist reflects on the commander of the demon army, Gu Xiang, and feels a formidable power emanating from him. He also notices that Durong is getting very nervous in the commander's presence. The protagonist replies to the commander, saying that his men have too much time on their hands and should at least stop to read a book. But the commander says that there is a saying that the ignorant are brave. The protagonist says that this saying is old, and that nowadays people with knowledge and courage are really valued, not least because they strategize and do what needs to be done. The commander says it's true. Perhaps he's too obsolete thinking like that. The protagonist thinks he's calmed down even after his provocation. The commander asks why the protagonist has been put in charge of the investigation this time, and the protagonist says that perhaps his father is trying to punish him, not least because he made a small mistake on a hunt with him. But that's a lie, obviously. But even though it's a lie, the commander finds it very funny. The protagonist thinks that everyone is certainly wondering why the second young master is taking part in this investigation. The commander also asks why the Nirvana Pavilion started this investigation. Was there another anonymous letter like last time? Durong says that they can't reveal that, but the protagonist says that yes, there was another anonymous letter. Durong is shocked when he says this, but the commander says he already knew. He says that being the commander isn't easy at all. There are a lot of ignorant and very rude people out there, and he's received all kinds of threats. It's really very tiring. The protagonist then tells them to finish the investigation as soon as possible, so as not to cause any more problems for anyone. The commander says, "Trouble? I thought our relationship was more than that." But the protagonist asks if it isn't a well-known fact that his brother, the Swordsman of the Bloody Sky, supports the protagonist's older brother, and not him. But the commander says that he is a completely different person from his brother, and that he will support the second young master. The protagonist gives a very fake smile and says that he will count on the commander's cooperation in the coming days. The commander says that he's going to count on him too, and that he's going to prepare this place here, putting up a little room for him to sleep in, and tells him to be careful, not least because he's very worried about our prota. The protagonist asks if he's referring to the fact that the last investigator has died, but the commander says it's not that, not least because he's sure that the cult leader's son won't die here. He's just worried. The protagonist thanks him for that. So they leave for now. But when they leave the room, the commander doesn't have a nice expression, no. But the protagonist has that naughty little smile. The protagonist now thinks that his father sent him here with one certainty. Either he himself dies, or the commander does. And speaking of him, the cult leader was talking to his advisor. The advisor says that it's a very important matter, and that he should take care of it, not according to the young master. But the celestial demon says that his son told him that they had completely lost the way of being a demon. The advisor asks if that's why he sent his son there, and the cult leader says that if he wants to talk about such great things, then he'll have to prove that he's great with his own actions. The counselor is in complete shock that the cult leader has done this, and meanwhile, in the Demon Army Pavilion, we see a raven hanging dead, and the army people are wondering what sign they're trying to leave. Why did they leave the dead crow here? The people think it was the Nirvana Pavilion that did it, and the protagonist realizes that the people who barred them at the entrance are the ones who are most angry about it, until someone says that it was too much, and a taller guy with a scar on his face approaches them. The protagonist asks who this person is. Who is this person? He calls himself Jang Ho, the commander of the 3rd platoon of the Demon Army. Durong says that this commander is apparently the most powerful of all the commanders, and that he has a very difficult temperament to deal with. The protagonist asks if Jang has any complaints to make, and Jang says that it goes without saying, right? What kind of thing did they put in the middle of a corridor where a lot of people are passing by? The protagonist replies that someone from the army threw this dead crow on his bed, so he thought it was something cultural, and hung it up. The commander says that instead of doing something so unpleasant, he could have punished the person who did it. The protagonist says that's fine, so he'll start with him, and Yang asks what he's talking about. The protagonist says, well, the investigation. Jang is already shocked that he mentioned it so suddenly. The protagonist says that he's now requesting all of Commander Jang's background checks, and also everything related to his finances, and all his money movements. But Jang says he can't do something like that to him. The protagonist doesn't even blink, saying that he can. Jang stomps on the floor, very angry, cracking the floor with that force. But the protagonist says that he understands that he must be frustrated by this, but that he knows there will be consequences if he stands in the way of the investigation. His soldiers begin to calm the commander down, telling him to let them pass. The protagonist says he's going to start the investigation for him, and Yang says that's fine. He just wants to see how it turns out. A little later, in the same pavilion, we see the protagonist and Durong sitting opposite Jang. They stare at each other for a moment, and the protagonist asks how long he's going to sit there, and test his patience. Jang asks what that means, and the protagonist says that he sent the letter. Didn't he? Durong wonders how he guessed that. Did the commander really do it? The commander asks what he's talking about, until the two of them stare at each other for a moment. Jang gives in and asks how the protagonist knows this. The protagonist says that he got involved in yesterday's incident more than necessary, and that this was to avoid suspicion falling on him. Jang says that's exactly what happened. The protagonist says that, in addition, the soldiers in his platoon are the most controlled, and when he hung up the crow, only the soldiers in the 3rd platoon didn't do anything. They didn't laugh or make fun of this kind of thing. What's more, their subordinates were worried about Commander Jang. The protagonist thinks that someone like Jang wouldn't be able to ignore corruption within his pavilion. The protagonist thinks that these weren't the only reasons why he made this assumption. He also remembers what Durong said, that Jang is the strongest of the commanders, and at the time the protagonist saw this through Durong's frequency transmission, he remembered his previous life, an incident where the commander of the strongest corps among the army commanders died, and probably the reason he died was the anonymous letter he sent. Jang says that he sent the letter, but didn't write down the exact details, although he never imagined that the second young master would come to carry out the investigation. The protagonist then asks him what he thought when he heard that, and Yang apologizes for saying it, but thinks they were screwed. The protagonist asks Durong if it's common for younger people to talk like that to older people, but Durong says that he's younger than Jang, right? The protagonist remembers that he's not in his past life, but says that they'll get back to the main subject anyway. What's going on in this place? Yang says that the commander is using the demon army for his own personal reasons. He's taking money from assassination requests and forcing his subordinates to do the job. Both the protagonist and Durong are shocked by this. The protagonist thinks he was getting involved in bad things, but this goes far beyond what he imagined. It's already a serious problem for an army to have its own martial artists freely roaming around, but now doing it for financial gain. Durong asks how this is possible, but the protagonist says that from his assumptions, analyzing the situation, it's probably the 1st platoon that's doing this. Yang says yes and asks how he knows that. The protagonist says that he knew this when he saw the reaction of the 3rd platoon, according to the relationship with the 1st platoon. He also says that the members of the 1st platoon were the first to stop the investigation and were also the ones who made the biggest fuss when the crow was hung up. The protagonist asks Jang how he found out it was them, and Jang talks about the martial artist who killed himself after killing the last investigator. He says that he was his friend and was also the first person to send the anonymous letter. The protagonist asks how close they were, and Yang seems to get a bit emotional about it, being a bit sad to talk about. He says that they entered the service together. It's like they're family. The protagonist asks who he thinks killed his friend, and Yang says that for sure it was the army commander who gave the order, but he thinks it was the commander of the 1st platoon who personally killed his friend. The protagonist thinks that, if what Ying is saying is true, this is a very serious case of corruption in which the army leader is involved, and the leader of the 1st platoon too. The protagonist thinks that they've even gone so far as to kill the investigator, and he wonders if his father or the advisor didn't already know about it, because he's sure they would have noticed, and maybe that's why he was sent here. His father wants to test him to see if he can solve this kind of problem. The protagonist tells Jang that he's made a very good friend. Jang says that, in fact, yes, he was a good friend, but that he wasn't a good friend to him, because he would have done something when he died. The protagonist is silent at this point, and then thanks Jang for all the cooperation he has given to the investigation. At the time, he is a little shocked by these words, but then bursts into tears for his friend who died. The protagonist thinks that, seeing all that is happening now, he might have hope that the lost demonic path will return. The divine heavenly demon cult he wants is a place where people like Zhang are taking on important roles. Although Zhang died in his previous life, he won't let it happen again, because the purpose of his regression is to save people who shouldn't have died. When they leave the conversation, Durong catches the protagonist's eye and says that he is very different from the rumors he has heard about him. The protagonist asks what kind of rumor he heard, and Durong apologizes before speaking, but they were rumors that said he wasn't very suitable to become the next demon. The protagonist says that's fine. It can be taken as a kind of compliment too. After all, for him to be suitable to be the heavenly demon doesn't really matter, not least because at the moment, the cult doesn't seem to be gripped by fear, and perhaps it's not time to change things. Durong is a little shocked by this, and the protagonist continues to think that this cult needs to change. If it doesn't, what's in store for him, for his family, and the cult? is all about extermination. The next day, we see someone eagerly calling the protagonist over to see something. As they get closer, the protagonist is shocked to see several people gathered together, and one person lying on the ground bloodied. Darong is also a little bruised. The protagonist asks if Darong is alright, and he says that he is, but that his colleague is badly hurt. The protagonist notices that his ribs are broken and tells him to take him to the infirmary immediately. The Nirvana Pavilion staff take him away, and the protagonist asks if Goang did it. He says that, of course he did. The protagonist asks why he hurt the Nirvana Pavilion investigator, and Goang says that it's because the jerk over there tapped him on the shoulder without apologizing and left. The protagonist says that he's absolutely sure it was Goang who bumped into him on purpose, so he's the one who should apologize now. Godin says that he's very perceptive because that's true, and the protagonist simply says that they're poison. Godin asks who he's referring to, and the protagonist says that his subordinates are poison to Goang. He wonders what the protagonist is talking about, and the protagonist says that the Goang last year also killed people in the same way, and 2 years ago, it also killed 3 members after a bar fight. The protagonist thinks that all the opponents Goang faced were weaker than him, and of course the demon army covered the whole situation so that he wouldn't be harmed. But Goang says that this is because there are many who don't revere the demon army as they should. The protagonist asks Godan a very important question. Does he know that the second young master has the authority to decide on an execution? Everyone is silent at this point, but Goang doesn't take it seriously, because even if he does, who's to say he'll be able to carry out the execution? The protagonist thinks that this is the poison he talked about before. Fools act like that, aware of how others see them. This should be a situation where he gets nervous. But instead, he's acting tough in front of his own subordinates. His head is almost up his own ass. He has no idea what a clown he's playing. The protagonist is rapidly approaching them. Obviously, everyone is getting ready to fight. The commander says that the protagonist is getting involved here. Our protagonist has to be very brave, but he says that at least he's not hiding behind his subordinates. And he says that he's hurt because of a certain someone. The protagonist says that's fine. He won't use his right hand either. Is that fair? But the commander asks him if he intends to go back to daddy if he gets hurt. The protagonist promises on his word that he won't take any responsibility if he ends up dying here. Darong wonders what the protagonist is up to, but it works very well, because the commander gets excited and now wants to fight. Darong secretly gives the protagonist a message and tells him that this commander is ambidextrous, so he can use a sword with both his left and right hands. The protagonist thinks that's why he's so confident, but he prepares nonetheless only with his left hand. Everyone tenses up for the fight, but the first to attack is the commander. His blow on the ground is so powerful that it cracks the ground along the way, and he tries to hit the protagonist every which way. But he's very fast, and even using only his left hand, he has quick movements with the blade and easily, like butter, cuts and rips off the commander's left arm. While he's there screaming in pain, he takes another blow to the face, now with the hilt of his sword, and falls to the ground without even being able to fight. The third platoon goes after Prota. Darren warns the protagonist to react to this, only for him to easily slit the necks of the first 2 who came at him, and the rest of the platoon are impressed and don't go for it. The protagonist says that he killed those 2 because that's treason, until he hears the commander begging for mercy. He's there, without his arm, crawling towards Prota, until the protagonist asks the commander what he thinks happened to the families of the people he killed in that bar fight. He doesn't have an answer to that, and the protagonist says that he doubts very much that he knows because he doesn't care. Does he? The protagonist says that the commander killed the son and husband of that family. They were no longer able to live as a normal family. The commander shouts that he was wrong at the time, but the protagonist tells him to be quiet and stomps on the commander's head. The platoon doesn't even have a reaction to that. Darren is also a little disgusted by the situation, but the protagonist simply asks him who he thinks he is for killing the people in his cult. In a completely different place, we see a beautiful woman playing an instrument, and in the same place, dancers are performing. We see someone pouring a drink into a glass, and it's the supreme commander of the demonic army and the protagonist sitting at the table. The commander says he's had problems, hasn't he? And the protagonist says that, yes, it wasn't intentional, but it was a conflict. The army leader says that the first commander was there because he didn't have much choice, apart from the fact that the first commander had a lot of questionable information about him. But the protagonist thinks this guy is really garbage, doesn't he? He's behind all this. He used the first commander as a subordinate, and now he's he's bad-mouthing his own subordinate. He goes on to say that since one of his commanders died during the investigation, the protagonist is sure to be the target of anything they try to pull. He asks what the protagonist thinks about this, what they think about just closing their investigation somehow. Or does the protagonist think that one commander and 3 dead subordinates is no big deal? The protagonist even thanks them for their consideration and says that he really wants to put an end to things. But there's a big problem, and the leader asks what it is. The protagonist says he has no evidence. He came for the official investigation and will return empty-handed, without any evidence. But the leader says that he can only forge evidence. The protagonist says that won't be possible, not least because the letter sent this time said that external requests for money had been accepted, and it's not something that can be easily covered up. To fill the whole investigation, the protagonist says that proof is needed. Only he thinks, without saying it, that this proof is the leader in front of him. He realizes Prota's malice. They stare at each other for a moment, and he thinks he has to put an end to the investigation. Later, we see Darren wondering what the second young master is doing there, and he says he's here to see the injured people. What's the problem? Darren says that the guy who was hurt is being healed now, and he thanks the protagonist for calling this doctor. The protagonist says there's no problem, because he's currently the investigator too, so they're working partners, until someone asks if the protagonist is there, and the demon doctor is the one who called him. The protagonist thinks that he is the most qualified doctor in the cult, and that he doesn't just treat anyone, he only treats important people within the cult. The protagonist asks how the guy is, and the doctor replies that, fortunately, his life is not in danger, but he will have to recover for a long time before returning to work. The protagonist says that this person was injured while carrying out very important work in the cult, so the doctor had to use the best medicines, and he says he'll do exactly as he's told, until the protagonist realizes that the Nirvana people were looking at him strangely, except that they were really grateful. The protagonist is a bit put out by this, straightens up, but continues his conversation with Darren, who asks what the army commander said. The protagonist says that he wants to put all the blame on the commander of the first platoon, and Darren is shocked by this, because his most important subordinate died, and he doesn't even care. But the protagonist says that he wasn't an important subordinate for the army leader. He was just a poor guy who happened to be there, at the right place at the right time. Darren asks what the protagonist is going to do now, and he says he's going to set a trap for the army leader. Darren is a little confused as to what this is going to look like, but the protagonist says he'll let him know if he takes the bait. Darren asks, "Okay, so what do I do now?" And the protagonist simply says, "Well, come and drink with me." Darren smiles and says it'll be on his tab tonight, and we see that the protagonist has managed to create a bond with him. The next day, there is a pile of books and parchment scattered everywhere, and Darren tells him that the assassination request register and banknotes worth thousands of Nayang were discovered in the house of the commander of the first platoon. But the protagonist thinks that's exactly what he wanted. The army leader has fallen into the trap, and he tells Darren that since he wants him to find out who the smartest person in the first platoon is, because he's sure there's someone with that reputation, and surely it was this guy who did it. He himself is going to meet the army commander again. After all, it will buy Darren time to find this guy. A little later, he's already meeting the army commander and informs him that he got the evidence from the first platoon commander's house. The commander says that's great, that they can celebrate by having a drink, but the protagonist says there's a problem, and the commander asks what it is this time. The protagonist says that the evidence came here from the demon army, and they must find where the evidence came from. The commander asks if the origin really matters that much, and the protagonist says that it does, because the chief advisor isn't an idiot. If the evidence doesn't come from here, even if he assumes it's from the demon army, the counselor will be suspicious of the investigation. The commander thinks about the counselor and then asks what the protagonist suggests. The protagonist says that he thinks they should act as if they were investigating for a while, mobilize a staff, carry out a large-scale investigation. For just one day, it might be enough. The commander frowns, and the protagonist says that he didn't want to do that either. He wants to finish as quickly as possible, but they can't arouse suspicion either, can they? And the commander says that's fine. He'll ask their subordinates to cooperate with Prota. Then the protagonist smiles a little because the plan is working. He doesn't think he needs the official documents. What he's looking for are the first documents used to hire the demon army and the proof that they were taken on missions outside of here. This is necessary so that he can look at the handwriting of whoever wrote it. In the next scene, the protagonist already has someone to interrogate. His name is Yanggu, and he's from the 1st platoon. Yanggu asks why he's there, but our protagonist just glares at him. The protagonist tells him that he's there because he forged the murder request records that were sent to the demon army. Yanggu pretends not to know what the protagonist is talking about, but the protagonist says, "No, I didn't think you knew anything, because you only did what you were told." But at this point, in order not to get screwed, Yanggu has to be honest. Yanggu continues to say that he didn't do any of this, that he didn't receive any orders, but the protagonist says that he understands why he's so scared, not least because he's afraid that the army commander will kill him. Then Yanggu doesn't speak for a moment, but the protagonist simply tells him that he can leave now. The protagonist says that since Yanggu doesn't want to answer anything, there's nothing he can do, not least because the protagonist doesn't like torturing someone who has only followed orders. He says, "That said, do you know this information here? As long as the investigators manage to get out of this place safely, the army commander is going to kill you eventually anyway, not least because the commander must already know that Yanggu has been captured. And what happens if you get out of here without any injuries? Obviously they'll think you opened your mouth." The protagonist is sure that Yanggu knows very well what the commander is capable of. Later, in a conversation with Darren, he says that, based on the word of Zhang, the commander of the 3rd platoon, the commander of the army is the one who ordered the killing of the investigator in the Nirvana Pavilion, and the person who carried out those orders would be Dong, and of course, he's already dead. But he also carried out many other atrocious acts. Darren says that these two people killed a lot of people, but the army commander simply can't be arrested. But the protagonist says that's not a problem, because he's not going to arrest him, he's going to kill him. Darren is shocked when he says this, not least because if he kills the commander, the Swordsman of the Bloody Sky will make his move. He won't let his brother be executed, and if that really happens, everything will get very complicated. But the protagonist says that there will also be a lot of fabricated evidence to show that no one ordered him to commit these crimes, and of course, there will be a lot of slander against our prota. But the most important thing is that if the commander of the demonic army stays alive, he will silence everyone so that they never speak of these crimes again. And Jung, who wrote the letter, will also die. Then everyone in the 3rd platoon will try to avenge their commander and will die too. And the protagonist says that even Darren will be at risk if the commander comes out of this alive. But if the commander of the demon army dies in the process, everything will be very different. And the only thing left to do at the end of all this is to prove the crimes. Darren asks if the protagonist is going to be okay, because surely the Bloody Sky swordsman will want revenge. But the protagonist says that not everyone seeks revenge when their family members die, especially the swordsman of the Bloody Sky. He won't risk losing his life for revenge. Then the protagonist suddenly gets up, and Darren asks where he's going. He says he's already told you. He's going to kill the army commander. And Darren is like, "Oh my god." Later, he has already met the commander. And he says that he was able to complete the investigation thanks to the commander. He says he's very happy about this and feels much more relieved, but a little sad that he won't be spending more time with our prota. The protagonist says that if he becomes the successor in the future, he will certainly take the time to talk to him. The commander will never forget how easy it was to finish the investigation because of our prota. The protagonist thinks it's true what he said. He'll never forget it. Here, a person as greedy as the commander, losing so much all at once, he'll never forget it. The protagonist tells them to drink in celebration of the end of the investigation. Of course, the old drinker grabs a cup too, but while he's pouring the drink, the protagonist asks him why he did it, not least because the money the commander has is more than enough to die of old age. But even so, he used the demon army to make external requests in exchange for money. Then the commander stares at him for a while, puts the cup on the table, and says that he has no way of knowing, because he should ask the body, the dead commander of the 1st platoon. The protagonist says that a puppet wouldn't know anything, and the commander asks him what he means by that. But the protagonist only says that he's curious to know what the commander really thinks. The protagonist thinks that there's nothing inside the commander either, just infinite greed. At this point, the commander blows up his cup and asks if the protagonist has gone mad, but the protagonist says it's the commander who's crazy with all his demands, until the commander breaks down and says that he's had enough of this kind of talk. The protagonist continues calmly sipping his drink until he notices that there is a blade in his chest. As the protagonist continues to drink, he is told that this is the 5th technique of the art of the ascending sword, the celestial blow. The protagonist now puts down his drink and tells Commander Gu Shoni that he is now being arrested for using the demon army for personal use, for 20 murders, and for impeding the investigations into the murders. The commander, who can't even react with a blade in his chest, says that, for a prison, it's a bit too aggressive, but the protagonist said that he would be executed anyway, until he takes the blade out. along with a lot of the commander's blood, and he didn't seem to have any expression on his face. The commander spits out a lot of blood and finally drops dead. And everyone, when they see this, is completely shocked because the commander of the demon army is dead. The protagonist tells everyone that he died as a result of resisting arrest. He orders Dae-ryong to arrest everyone in the first platoon and says that this case will now be officially investigated. Dae-ryong is about to do his part, and he tells the commander of the third platoon, Jang-ho, that everyone is now under his responsibility, except members of the first platoon, and that everyone must help the Nirvana Pavilion investigators. The protagonist says that he has been given full authority to take complete control of this matter. Therefore, his orders are the orders of the cult. Jang says he understands what he's going to do, and both Darren and Jang were thinking the same thing. The protagonist gives them a little smile because he has managed to resolve the situation. A little later, he went back to the demon cult to talk to his father, of course. But who was also waiting there was the Swordsman of the Bloody Sky. The protagonist was already prepared for what was to come. When the Swordsman of the Bloody Sky arrived, his eyes filled with rage. The protagonist bows to everyone and says that it's good to see the Bloody Sky Swordsman again. He asks back if the second master is doing well, but he also wants to ask Prota something. The protagonist says there's no need, he can go and read the report, but he says he'd like to hear it from Prota himself. The protagonist glances at his father and thinks that his father is silent because he wants to see how the protagonist reacts to all this. The protagonist says that, based on the investigation, they have discovered that his brother has committed many serious crimes, as well as the fact that he tried to kill the second young master while in prison. He even apologizes for his death, but the Swordsman of the Bloody Sky says that he did the right thing. If his brother committed a crime, he should be punished. He thinks that his brother was pathetic to have acted in such a way, but there is a catch. He says that his brother is not such an idiot as to attack the person who is arresting him while his crimes are exposed. The protagonist thinks that, probably after he was caught, he asked his brother for help. The Bloody Sky Swordsman must know that the protagonist killed him just to avoid any more trouble. And the protagonist says that he doesn't know why he did it either. Perhaps he just couldn't accept the fact that he had been caught by someone younger than him. But the swordsman says that he saw his brother's body before he came here, and it looks like he was hit in the chest with just one blow. He says that the protagonist's martial skills are much better than he thought, but the protagonist says that it's thanks to his father and also to the fact that the commander was very nervous and agitated by his crimes being exposed, which meant that he couldn't react very well to the attack. The swordsman smiles and thanks the protagonist for telling the truth, but the protagonist says no. He feels very bad about what happened, but in his head, he's thinking that the swordsman isn't showing any trace of anger. He killed the swordsman's brother and thought he was about to explode with rage, but the swordsman simply faces the celestial demon and says that he needs to make the funeral arrangements. Then you can go and rest. The swordsman thanks the celestial demon for his consideration and leaves. Perhaps the swordsman really wants to tell the protagonist's father that he's overstepped his bounds by putting the second young master in charge, and perhaps he also wants to tell him that he has another way of dealing with this situation. And now, at this moment, it's just Prota, the counselor, and the celestial demon. The counselor congratulates the protagonist on having managed to resolve this incident and asks if he's hurt anywhere, but he says no, and thanks him for his concern. The counselor was about to say something, but gave up. Then someone approaches Prota, and they are carrying something. The counselor says that this is from the celestial demon, who wants to reward him for his work. We see a very beautiful blade inside his cloak, and the counselor says that the cult leader has given this sword to Prota. He thinks that this sword is the Black Demon Sword, one of the swords in the Heavenly Treasure, along with the White Demon Sword. The protagonist is very grateful for the sword, but says that the white sword suits his personality better. His father says no, the black sword suits the second young master perfectly. The protagonist says that he doesn't know much about his own son, and when he draws the sword, he can feel this completely different energy. The protagonist thinks that its energy is cold, but he hasn't even used his internal energy. The celestial demon gives a little smile, and the counselor notices. It's one of the few times he's seen the cult leader smile, and he's impressed. The protagonist puts the sword away and says that the reward is too good and that perhaps he doesn't deserve it. But the counselor says that it's not a suitable reward because the commander of the demon army was the most serious problem lately, and he himself didn't expect the protagonist to do it so cleanly. He asked the cult leader if he expected it, And he says of course not. He says he was lucky to get out of the mission alive, but the protagonist doesn't think so. His father only sent him there because he trusted him. The protagonist's father knows that he has mastered the art of the flat sword, as well as knowing that he got the demon pill in that test. Surely the celestial demon didn't expect the protagonist to be able to kill the leader of the army. He thinks he knows why this sword was given to him. This is a statement to the swordsman of the bloody sky, which literally means that he is saying that, although he recognizes what he has done for the cult, it is not to tarnish his son for this incident. The protagonist thanks his father immensely for giving him this sword, and also for what it means. The celestial demon just stares at him for a moment and tells him he can leave now. He goes out into the garden, walking in the clear sky, until someone tells the second young master that the day is so clear and so peaceful that he should sit down for a while. The person who said this was the swordsman of the bloody sky, who was sitting in the garden. The protagonist knew that he would still be here, until the swordsman sees the sword that the protagonist is now carrying, but the protagonist simply sits down calmly and says that it's a hot summer here. But when the protagonist sits down, the swordsman of the bloody sky starts shouting angrily and says, how dare he ambush his brother and kill him. He says he's going to tear off every limb and put them all in a row in his brother's grave. The protagonist senses his flaming aura, but with a smile, the swordsman suddenly calms down and says, that's what he should say, isn't it? But Prota pushes the handle of his sword this time. The protagonist starts to get angry too, and says that his old brother didn't act responsibly or maturely. How can someone who has so much responsibility for the cult do this kind of shit just for his own personal desires? He also says that if he does anything for his corrupt brother, the protagonist himself will chop up his old body too. The protagonist stays calm and says that if he said that, it would be answered. The swordsman of the bloody sky is shocked for a moment, but then he starts laughing loudly, so loudly that his ear hurts, and everyone from afar can hear it. The swordsman also says that he must have taken it easy on his brother, didn't he? The protagonist says yes, that he did it as quickly as possible, and he says that the army commander really did cross a line, or in fact, he could even say that the line never existed for him. The swordsman says that he understands this very well. The protagonist says that the swordsman of the bloody sky knew about this corruption that his brother was doing. Why did he let it go unpunished? But he says it's because his brother didn't listen to him. He's not very guilt-free either, is he? But when he saw that his brother had died, he honestly felt relieved, because now he knows. He knows deep down in his chest that he won't be in his way anymore. The protagonist thinks he can't believe he had that kind of relationship with his brother. The two of them stand there in silence in the garden. The protagonist says that he knows how he feels, because he would probably feel the same way if his older brother died, and he feels relieved that he doesn't have to kill him himself. The swordsman was a little shocked by what he said, but the protagonist was saying it calmly. That's it for today, folks.
The swordsman remained silent, watching the protagonist with an enigmatic expression. Intrigued, the protagonist asked what he was seeing with those eyes. After a while, the swordsman looked away, stood up, and casually commented, "It looks like this year is going to be a hot." As he walked away, the protagonist thought aloud. It's a good thing. He doesn't seem to be the type who can't stand the heat. Watching the bloody sky swordsman leave, the protagonist reflected. He couldn't understand the swordsman's thoughts, but he felt a twinge of relief. Still, he couldn't help thinking, I killed his brother. Maybe he still wants to kill me. Or maybe he'll just let it pass, like the clouds in the sky. Shaking off his thoughts, he concluded firmly, "It doesn't matter. I don't regret what I did." Later, he decided to concentrate on his cultivation. He drew his new sword and contemplated it. The initial moments with a new weapon were crucial. He knew that a sword communes with its warrior, and his, the black demon sword, did this on a much deeper level. He smiled and said, "It's a pleasure to meet you. I'll be your master from now on." Concentrating, he infused the blade with energy. To his surprise, an intense aura emerged from it, startling him for a moment. "This sword is different," he murmured in awe. Excited, he began to test it out. He made a thrust and remembered how he had survived with this sword technique for a long time. With quick, fluid movements, he practiced until the wee hours. Days passed, and the protagonist devoted himself entirely to training. Even Lion, worried, couldn't pull him out of his immersion. One morning, when he went outside, he was shocked by what he saw. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, of ill-figured swordsmen were forming an army in front of him. The bloody sky swordsmen? What are they doing here? He asked himself, already on alert. The protagonist felt their hostility. They were all channeling powerful demonic energy towards him. He thought, if I stay here too long, I could end up suffering internal injuries. The swordsmen were clearly trying to intimidate him, forcing him to retreat like a coward. But he didn't give in. Then an idea popped into his head. If I'm going to receive all this demonic energy, I can use the meridian strengthening technique. This secret technique transformed the energy of various opponents components into a method of strengthening the user's body. The more energy, the more efficient the process. This is my chance to strengthen my meridians, he decided. The demonic energy continued to press down on him. He could stand it, even though he was nervous. The technique advanced rapidly from one stage to the next. First, the second stage, then the third. The swordsman, sensing his resistance, began to worry. The protagonist persisted, reaching the fourth stage. Then, suddenly, everything stopped. When he came back to reality, he realized that he was in the middle of the swordsmen. They were looking at him with fear, especially the leader, who could barely face him. A heavy silence hung in the air, making room. The swordsman formed a corridor for him to pass through. The protagonist walked calmly through, without saying a word. On his father's throne, he waited. Sitting in the great hall, the silence was absolute. Suddenly, a voice came from behind him. It was the celestial demon. So you want to sit on the throne? The protagonist was visibly nervous, wondering how his father had sneaked up behind him. I don't want to sit on the throne. I don't want to fall into the trap of that chair, he said, trying to hide the tension in his voice. The celestial demon arched an eyebrow and asked with a slightly sarcastic tone, "Are you trying to be sophisticated again?" He gestured for the protagonist to come up. Sit on the throne. The protagonist hesitated, but eventually climbed up calmly and sat down. Meanwhile, the celestial demon looked on curiously. So, what's it like sitting there? From above, the protagonist had a wide view. He could see everything. However, when he looked around, all he found were cold, motionless statues. After a few seconds, he replied, "I thought I'd feel more excited, but I don't really feel any." The celestial demon let out a short laugh. "I felt the same way when I sat there for the first time." The protagonist thought silently. He knew that his father had killed many people, including one of his own brothers, to win that throne. If even he didn't feel excitement when he achieved that, I wonder what he felt. Suddenly, his father broke the silence. "About the sword demons who came after you. They acted on their own. It wasn't the bloody sky swordsman who sent them." The protagonist stared at him in disbelief. "You knew that from the start, didn't you?" he continued, trying to keep his voice steady. "I acted like it was nothing. I endured all that demonic energy. I refused to be suppressed by them. But when I came out, I started shaking." The celestial demon narrowed his eye, puzzled. Why was he so scared? Were they really that terrifying? The protagonist shook his head. "It wasn't that. I was afraid because I thought my judgment might be wrong. If someone there had lost patience and attacked, I could have died. Even if I had survived, I could never be considered his successor. Not after slaughtering the demonic swordsman." He paused, looking down at his hands, and then added, "That's what scared me. The thought that, at some point, I'll have to make a decision that will put lives at risk again." "Surprisingly," he admitted, "and strangely enough, I missed you at that moment." The celestial demon raised an eyebrow. "The demonic human doesn't look back. He looks to the future." The protagonist was momentarily surprised. Wait, did he just try to comfort me? Confused, but also a little touched, he smiled. Trying to break the moment, he commented, "I was thinking, maybe we should replace those statues with something prettier. How about one of those beautiful women from the central plane? The four flowers, for example." His father gave him a look of pure disgust. The protagonist laughed nervously. "Okay, I guess I thought too much. I'm talking garbage." He slowly rose from his throne and said, "You had better sit down." As he was leaving, he suddenly turned around and asked, "Dad, do you think I'll have to kill the bloody sky swordsman?" The celestial demon laughed out loud. "You managed to kill the commander, but you could never defeat the bloody sky swordsman in this state." The protagonist smiled. "So why did you create this conflict between us? Perhaps you should take responsibility for that, don't you think?" The celestial demon replied calmly, "Yes, I will. And to begin with, I'll make you the leader of the Nirvana Pavilion." The protagonist was confused. The Nirvana Pavilion? The same place as Inspector Burot and his cult. Why does he want me to lead it now? His father stared at. "What's wrong? Didn't you want discipline and order in that place?" The protagonist didn't reply. Lost in thought, he reflected. Maybe he's using me to solve something he's been putting off for a long time. It doesn't matter if I live or die. They stared at each other in silence. The protagonist clenched his fists and said firmly, "If you want me to kill a cow, at least give me a knife." The celestial demon smiled slightly. "And what exactly do you want?" The protagonist answered without hesitation, "I want access to the celestial demon archives." The celestial demon raised an eyebrow. "Do you think you'll find some supreme martial art in there?" The celestial demon looked at his son skeptically, frowning. "You are terribly mistaken. Just the martial arts titles in the celestial demon archives would be more than you can bear." The protagonist pondered. He knew that the manuals found there were valuable, but probably not as superior as the techniques he already knew, such as the flying sword. "Nevertheless," he answered, "I want to test my luck." The celestial demon stared at him for a long moment, assessing his intentions. "I don't know what kind of impure idea you have, but I'll let you enter the celestial demon archives for 7 days." The protagonist bowed his head in gratitude. "Thank you, Dad." In the archives, the protagonist explored the vast collection of techniques, reflecting on his past life. He thought, returning to the cult of the celestial demons. Who would have thought that I would be alive to do this? Decades ago, my identity was disfigured and erased. And it took a long time before I could ascend and understand what that cult really meant. He remembered one technique in particular that he had heard about from the cult leader in his previous life, the 4 steps of the wind god. This legendary art of mobility consisted of 4 movements, said to be a complementary technique to the martial arts of the celestial demon. However, at some point in history, knowledge of it was lost. The only one who mastered it was Zhu Bikdo, leader of the cult at the time. In his memory, he visualized the conversation with Zhu Bikdo. I only became a leader because I found this technique, Zhu Bikdo had said. If it was in the archives all along, why did everyone think it was lost? The protagonist asked. Because it wasn't on the shelves, back in the present. While exploring the place, he noticed some pages lying on the floor. Zhu Bikdo had mentioned that the technique was hidden as a support for the 19th bookcase, being treated as a useless weight. The protagonist picked up the weathered book and flipped through it. There it was, the legendary martial art, he thought. Only 4 steps, but enough to cross the whole world. He began to cultivate the technique, which consisted of 4 main movements. Shadow step, perfect for infiltration, allowing you to avoid detection. With practice, it became extremely versatile. Flashing step, a quick, almost instantaneous movement that confused enemies and made dodging easier. Death step, a lethal move, capable of penetrating defenses and reaching enemies with deadly precision. Soft step, the pinnacle of mobility, allowing you to move faster than human understanding can process. In the 7 days that passed, the protagonist devoted himself entirely to this art. In the end, he emerged from the celestial demon archives and went straight to his father. In the throne room, the celestial demon was waiting for him, sitting imposingly. "Are you back?" he asked, staring at him with piercing eyes. "Yes," the protagonist replied calmly. "And what did you learn?" Without hesitation, the protagonist said, "I have learned an art of mobility, the 4 steps of the wind god." The celestial demon arched an eyebrow in disbelief. "That's absurd. The shadow pass has been lost for ages." The protagonist replied firmly, "I wouldn't have the courage to lie to my father about something like that." The celestial demon rose from his throne, crossing his arms. "Then show what you've learned." The protagonist smiled. "What do I get in return?" His father snorted. "His life, perhaps." The protagonist closed his eyes, concentrating. When he opened his eyes again, his energy filled the room. He started with the shadow step. To the heavenly demon's astonishment, he disappeared completely, appearing at another point in the hall. Then another, and another. The celestial demon's eyes widened, and he stood up abrupt. "Impossible." The protagonist continued, his figure moving like illusions, leaving trails of shadows across the hall. The celestial demon couldn't contain his surprise. "Where did you learn this technique?" "In the celestial demon archives," replied the protagonist calmly. "That's a lie. That technique doesn't exist in this place," roared the celestial demon. The protagonist remained calm, but insisted, "I definitely learned it in the celestial demon archives." The celestial demon crossed his arms, his expression visibly irritated. "Are you really going to keep lying?" he asked coldly, without losing his serene tone. The protagonist replied, "And you're so sure? There are countless books and places in that archive. There may be something you haven't seen." They stared at each other for a long moment, the silence heavy in the air. Finally, the celestial demon spoke. "So you already knew where you were, did you?" The protagonist smiled slightly. "No, it was pure coincidence." His father narrowed his eyes, but decided not to press. Taking a deep breath, he muttered, "If it was there, the most important part of the manual must have been removed." The protagonist arched an eyebrow. "And how do you know that?" "Because that's what I would do," replied the celestial demon. Turning away from his son, he paused, pondering, and then said, "Teach me the steps." The protagonist sighed internally. He had been waiting for this moment, he thought. "My task is not to defeat my father or take his throne. My real mission is to destroy HWA Mugi and save both my father and the demon cult. Still, sharing that with him won't be a problem." After a brief reflection, he replied, "No." The celestial demon turned abruptly, his eyes shining with a mixture of curiosity and irritation. "Nothing is free in this world," continued the protagonist. His father stared at him. "As I recall, I taught you a hunting technique without asking for anything in return, didn't I?" The protagonist gave a mischievous smile. "Actually, there was a price. That expensive and delicious liqueur you had." The celestial demon looked at him with your disgust. "You've really matured into a brazen man." Laughing, the protagonist replied, "It's all part of the process of growing up." His father sighed deeply. "There's something you want in return, isn't there?" The protagonist nodded. "I want to learn the art of heavenly demon defense." This legendary technique completely protected the body and was considered a kind of second life for anyone who mastered it. Only the current celestial demon could learn it. But the protagonist persisted. "Teach me secretly. Nobody needs to know." The celestial demon was thoughtful, then asked, "How do you plan to do that?" "This technique has no external visual manifestations. There's no way for others to realize that I've learned it." "Right." The celestial demon pondered for a moment, but before he could decide, the protagonist spoke, "If you don't want to, that's fine. I'm leaving. Think about the proposal." As he started to leave, his father interrupted him. "Hold on. Teach me the 4 steps of the wind god." God first. The protagonist turned around slowly, wondering if he could really trust his father's word. Now we're talking, he said with a wry smile. His father stared at him. Aren't you afraid I'll betray you? The protagonist shook his head. No, you're not the kind of person who would subject yourself to such humiliation in front of your own son. With that, he began to dictate the steps of the technique. The celestial demon concentrated his energy, and the entire hall began to tremble with the immense power he was emanating. The protagonist watched as his father assimilated the steps, disappearing and reappearing like a series of illusions. Finally, the celestial demon stopped, returning to his throne with an expression of admiration. This technique is really impressive, the protagonist thought to himself. My regression was worth it. Will HWA Mugi still be able to defeat him after this? Suddenly, the celestial demon spoke. I'm going to teach you the art of heavenly demon defense now. Listen carefully. I won't repeat it. The protagonist nodded, attentive. He had memorized each step carefully, knowing that this technique could mean the difference between life and death. Later, while reflecting on his learning, Leon noticed the large mark on his head. Who did this to you? She asked, furious. Tell me now. I'll deal with that arrogant bastard. The protagonist laughed nervously. It was my father. The silence that followed was awkward. Leon, speechless, just looked away. The protagonist, for his part, recalled the intense moment when he was trying to master the technique. Taking a deep breath, he thought to himself, I did it. I've learned the art of heavenly demon defense. The protagonist smiled excitedly. Now we share a secret. Dad, I'm more than happy to have learned this technique from you. At that moment, the celestial demon, without any warning, delivered the biggest blow of his life to his forehead. The impact was so strong that the protagonist stepped back, holding his sore forehead. Don't be so cheeky, grumbled his father. The protagonist, his forehead still red, turned to Leon, who was watching the scene from a distance. Why are you standing there? Aren't you going to deal with him? Leon replied calmly, with a slight smile. I'm the type who defends, not attacks. You know? The protagonist laughed, despite the pain. He thought, in my past life, she never made that kind of joke. I'm glad she can joke now. He caught her eye, his tone becoming more serious. Listen, Leon, I can't do it now, but I promise that in the future, I'll cure you of the side effects of the body petrification technique. Just wait a little longer. She stared at him in surprise, but the protagonist continued. I've also told the cult leader that this place needs to change. I want to create an environment where people don't have to sacrifice their bodies to protect others. This will be a safe place for people like you, Leon. She turned red, visibly embarrassed, but looked at him with admiration. The protagonist, for his part, took a deep breath, assuming a firm posture. Listen to me, Leon. As of this moment, you are dismissed as my warrior bodyguard. Her shock was immediate. Her shock. Why? She asked, stunned. Because you were chosen to become captain of the Black Ghost Corporation. She widened her eyes in surprise. Black Ghosts. That group doesn't even exist, does it? Not yet, but it will be created. It will be an elite group that will report directly to me. Leon hesitated, still processing the information. So, you made me captain of something that doesn't even exist. The protagonist crossed his arms, looking at her seriously. Are you going to accept or not? They stared at each other for a moment, her eyes shining with admiration finally. Leon replied, Leon, accept that order. Later, in the city, the protagonist was in disguise, carefully observing the movement. He reflected. I told Leon that I would create this group, but forming an organization like this is not easy. I need capital to get it. I'm going to take advantage of an incident that happened before my regression. In front of him, a caravan was getting ready. A burly man with an air of leadership spoke to those gathered. My name is Young Dang, and I will be leading this mission. It pays well, but it's highly dangerous. So any idiot who tries to do something stupid will die by my hand. Young Dang turned to the protagonist, eyeing him suspiciously. Was he recommended by Seo? Yes, replied the protagonist. And can I trust your skills? With a slight smile, the protagonist replied, you'll only know if you cut me in half, but then it will be too late to recognize my power. Young Dang narrowed his eyes in annoyance. Don't be so cheeky. The arrogant fall as easily as dry leaves. The protagonist shrugged. I'm here to follow orders and get paid. That's all. Young Dang gave him a suspicious look. I'll keep an eye on you. The protagonist observed the caravan, noticing a woman and a child among the travelers. He thought to himself, in my past life, they died during this mission. This time, I'm going to save them. The woman and child climbed into a carriage, which was surrounded by well-armed guards. As the sun was setting, Young Dang announced, we're going to camp here for the day. Eat your rations. We don't know when the next meal will be. Some mercenaries complained about the dried meat. That's it. One of them grumbled. Another replied, at least we have fuel for our bodies. The protagonist remained silent, but thought about the mission. In my past life, I heard that this caravan was ambushed by bandits. Even the corpses weren't found. Nobody knows exactly how they died. The night fell quietly, but soon the tranquility was interrupted. Suddenly, sounds of coughing and grunting took over the camp. The protagonist turned around. Alarmed. People were spitting blood, falling to the ground, dead within moments. The protagonist observed the chaos around him. Bodies fell, spitting blood, while he remained unharmed. He frowned and thought, poison. But why am I okay? It was then that he noticed young Dang, the tour leader, standing calmly, as healthy as before. The connection was immediate. It was him. The protagonist crossed his arms and declared, I didn't eat anything you offered. Young Dang shrugged, a cynical smile on his face. What a shame. It would have been easier for you to die soon. The protagonist looked at him with disdain. Your lifestyle is pathetic. What do you intend to do with all that money? Killing your own companions. Young Dang laughed scornfully. What else? Liquor. Women. The protagonist narrowed his eyes in disappointment. Did you kill those people for that? Young Dang replied dismissively. Stop being an idiot. Worry about your own life before you question mine. Before they could continue, a third man appeared. His presence was intimidating, and he spoke in a cold voice. Is it over? Groups of hooded and masked people emerged from the shadows, and the protagonist immediately realized that they were dangerous. These guys are strong. Young Dang looked stunned. Why are you already here? One of the masked men stepped forward, ignoring him completely. Get out of the carriage before I burn it. Slowly, a woman and a child got out of the carriage, trembling with fear. The masked man, who turned out to be Kwon Muin, glared at them. Women who hide like rats. They were hard to find. The woman, desperate, spoke in a pleading tone. Kwon, please, at least spare the child's life. Kwon looked at her with a wry smile. That's fine. I'll save it for the sake of our relationship. But then he laughed, his expression turning grim. That's what you thought I'd say, isn't it? Kneel down. Ask for mercy. How dare you make such a request? The child began to cry, and the woman tried desperately to negotiate. If you spare the child, I'll give you 10 times the money you need. Kwon snorted. Shut up. Your father has already been captured. The news left her completely stunned and speechless. Meanwhile, Kwon noticed the protagonist standing in the distance. And who are you? The protagonist replied indifferently. Just someone paid to escort. Kwon turned to Young Dang. Is that one of your subordinates? Young Dang waved his hand. No, he's just a bum I hired. You can eliminate him now. Kwon laughed scornful. Very well, then finish him off. The protagonist crossed his arms, looking at Young Dang. Do you really think you'll get your reward? They'll probably kill you as soon as I fall. Young Dang was visibly nervous, but before he could react, Kwon slashed his neck with one swift movement. Too soft. He knew better than to trust these bums. The protagonist looked at the fallen body, muttering, that's what happens to traitors. Kwon pointed at his guard, annoyed. How long will it take you to kill this idiot? Do it now. The guards advanced, but the protagonist remained calm. He turned to the woman and spoke gently. Cover the child's eyes. She hesitated, but obeyed, covering the child's eyes and closing her own. The protagonist faced the battlefield, his expression serious. The moment the guards approached, he activated the 4 steps of the wind god, using the death step. In the blink of an eye, he was in the middle of the group, and all the guards fell to the ground, decapitated. Kwon stepped back, completely shocked. How did you get here so quickly? The woman opened her eyes and was paralyzed at the sight of the massacre. Kwon, stuttering, asked, Who are you? The protagonist replied coldly. That should be my question. Who are you? The woman intervened, her voice trembling. That man is Kwon Muin, one of the vassals of my house. She took a deep breath and introduced herself. I am Jim Sayan, daughter of the master of the Golden Mansion. The protagonist narrowed his eyes, thinking, so that's it. She's the daughter of GM Ash, the biggest merchant in the Central Plains, the richest man in Fujian. He adjusted his posture, determined to protect her. The protagonist pondered, observing GM Sayan, who still looked frightened. In my past life, there was an incident where the master of the Golden Mansion, GM Ash, was betrayed by his vassal and lost his life. His daughter also died. This time, that won't happen. While he was immersed in his thoughts, Kwon Muin stared at him, waiting for an opening. When he thought he had found the perfect moment, he attacked by surprise from behind. However, the protagonist reacted without even looking, moving his sword with precision. Within moments, Kwon's head rolled across the floor. The cut was so clean that the enemy's body remained standing for a few seconds before collapsing. Jim Sayan was completely shocked. The protagonist wiped his blade and said coldly, scum like him always tries to attack from behind. He deserved nothing less. Sayan, still trembling, begged, please help us. I'll pay you as much as you want. The protagonist gave a slight smile. As the situation is different, my price will be a little higher. No matter how much it is, I will pay. Please save my father too. Sayan insisted. The protagonist smiled more broadly. Just what I wanted. All right, let's go. In the Golden Mansion, a bearded man laughed with satisfaction. Finally, we got those two. 10 years of planning have finally paid off. He interrupted his celebration, frowning. But where is Kwon Muin? A calm voice interrupted him. Everyone is dead. The man turned and saw the protagonist standing there with a serene smile. Who did that? He asked, confused and in shock. The protagonist replied, a young martial artist. Very skilled, I must say. The bearded man hesitated, trying to understand. Then a moment of silence fell before he realized. It was you. The protagonist tilted his head with a wry smile. Good eye. Soon, the hall was filled with enemies, surrounding the protagonist and GM Sayan. The bearded man laughed. If you saved the woman and the child, you should have run away. Why did you go back to the lion's den? The protagonist shrugged, looking around. Lions, all I see are a lot of scared kittens. The silence that followed followed was heavy, and the bearded man finally spoke. So you killed Quan Nguyen and all the others. You entered the enemy's base, and you still seem so confident. You're something, huh? The protagonist gave a slight smile without losing his cool. I'm glad you noticed. The bearded man tried a softer tone. Maybe we can talk. Can I get you a drink? You don't have to be so polite, replied the protagonist. I won't take it easy, even if you beg. The bearded man shouted angrily to his men. Kill him now. The protagonist calmly drew his sword. In an instant, he disappeared using the shadow step. Within seconds, one of the enemies was split in half, followed by another with his head cut off. He advanced through the hall, using impeccable techniques, turning the combat into a massacre. The bearded man was in shock when he saw that all his men had fallen. Who the hell are you? He asked, terrified. The protagonist replied coolly. Nobody, just a swordsman trying to make some money. The bearded man, desperate, tried to negotiate. Money? If that's what you want, I can give it to you. As much as you want. The protagonist arched an eyebrow. You're rich, aren't you? Yes, a lot. Enough money to change your life, the bearded man exclaimed. So why did you do this to the golden mansion? If you already had so much money, why did you keep stealing from others? Asked the protagonist, his voice full of contempt. The bearded man hesitated, unable to answer. Just then, one of the remaining men appeared, holding GM Ash hostage. GM Saiyan screamed in despair. The bearded man laughed, regaining his confidence. Put down your sword, or the master of the manor will die. The protagonist, however, showed no hesitation. He raised his blade, drawing a blow in a great trajectory that cut through the floor, the walls, and the ceiling. The energy was so intense that the enemy with GM Ash was cut in half. The bearded man watched in complete despair. Oh, what was that? The protagonist replied calmly. The fourth form of the flying sword Flame of Heaven. The bearded man fell to his knees, paralyzed with fear. The protagonist stepped forward, looking at the bearded man with a slight smile. So, what were you really talking about? The enemy stepped back, despair on his face. Hold on, he asked nervously. But the protagonist paid no attention. I don't care what you say. If you don't want to die, fight now. The bearded man hesitated, but drew his sword, forcing himself forward. He shouted, charging his blade with energy, promising to use everything he had to survive. His attacks were devastating, but the protagonist calmly avoided them, dodging some and blocking others. Is he really using all his strength? Thought the protagonist. On the other hand, the bearded man believed he was close to winning. He'll give in, just a little more. But before he knew it, his vision blurred. He looked down and saw the protagonist's blade embedded in his chest. The protagonist stared at the man coldly. Pathetic. You spent your life training, but your greed led you to die a traitor. You were a bodyguard, paid to protect, not to do this. He drew his sword, letting the blood flow. If you want to be rich in your next life, be a merchant. The bearded man's body fell lifeless, and the protagonist wiped his blade clean before turning around. Later, at the Golden Mansion, GM Ash and his family thanked the protagonist with reverence. I'll never forget what you did for us, the benefactor who saved my family. What's your name? The protagonist answered simply. Just a tramp who was passing by. Ash smiled. Only a bum wouldn't do all that, wouldn't he? The protagonist shrugged, maintaining his humble posture. GM Saiyan then remembered. Dad, I promised we'd pay him a reward. GM Ash nodded, and he did well. It's a promise we'll keep. He turned to the protagonist. If you want money, you've come to the right place. The protagonist thought to himself. That's exactly why I disguised myself as a tramp. In a dark, underground corridor, GM Ash guided the protagonist to the vault. You saved our lives. Giving you everything we have would be fair, but it would be difficult to fulfill. The protagonist replied politely. I don't need all that. Ash smiled, opening the large vault doors. I have a simple rule. Take as much as you can carry, but only using your own inner energy. The protagonist laughed confidently. I'm going to carry a lot. Be sure of that. GM Ash nodded. It's all right. Without you, we'd be dead. The doors opened, revealing a vault full of gold, jewels, and treasures. The protagonist entered, his eyes lighting up at the sight of the fortune. GM Saiyan watched beside her father, muttering, he'll take more than you expect. He's very powerful. Ash smiled. What he has protected is worth more than anything else here. Having my daughter and granddaughter alive is all that matters. Saiyan was moved by her father's words, but Ash continued, observing the protagonist. He's not an ordinary person. I'm not just talking about skills. He has something unique, something that words can't describe. Saiyan was curious as Ash explained. I've met few people like this in my life, and never someone so young. He has confidence, determination, and a unique aura. We need connections like him. The more he takes away from here, the stronger our bond will be. Saiyan nodded, puzzled. A few days later, the protagonist returned to the pavilion. He thought to himself, I sold that gold and those treasures in several different places. I took too much for a single store to buy it all. Since leaving the city, the protagonist has gone around selling the treasures he has collected. He counted up the total, 38 million yang. That money will be the core of my plan, he thought, determined. Back in the throne room, the protagonist found his father, the celestial demon, next to his advisor. He watched in silence as his father received reports. This place decides the fate of many, he thought. Some live, others die, all based on his decisions. Is my father satisfied satisfied with this life? Does he, like me and Leon, want to leave this position? The celestial demon broke the silence. I heard you left. Yes, I was looking for money, replied the protagonist. And why do you need money? Because I don't want to use yours forever. Besides, I'll need a lot of funds for what I'm planning. The celestial demon stared at him, intrigued. What exactly are you planning? With a calm look, the protagonist replied, shocking both his father and the advisor. I want to create my own private group. The advisor was dumbfounded, but the celestial demon was direct. That's unacceptable. If you create your own group, your brothers will want it too, and that will divide the cult. I forbid it. The protagonist had expected resistance. Without hesitation, he pulled out a small scroll and handed it to his father. The celestial demon looked at it from a distance, using his energy to pull it from his son's hand. What's that? He asked, puzzled. It's your allowance. Pocket money? The advisor and the celestial demon were visibly confused. The protagonist explained with a smile. I know you're already the richest man in the world, but I wanted to do it at least once. I want to thank you for raising me. The advisor was speechless, but it was the celestial demon who surprised him. He gave a smile, something so rare that even the advisor turned to confirm what he saw. He smiled. The protagonist took the opportunity to leave. Have a good rest, Dad. The celestial demon remained silent, but his smile remained for a moment. Later, in the Nirvana Pavilion, the protagonist was standing next to Leon when he was approached by Darian, who arrived excitedly. Master, it's about time. Everyone is waiting for you. The protagonist looked at him curiously. Darian, you've come. I volunteered, Darian replied with a slight smile. I never imagined that we would meet again like this. Neither was I. Honestly, I was surprised. They both smiled, clearly happy to be working together again. It's time to go, said the protagonist, as the large doors opened. In front of him stood the entire Nirvana Pavilion, gathered and ready to welcome him. The atmosphere was unexpectedly friendly, and everyone greeted him as the new pavilion master. The protagonist looked around calmly and asked Darian, did you threaten to reduce their salary if they didn't hold a welcoming ceremony? Darian laughed. I didn't do anything like that. So why is everything so friendly? Insisted the protagonist. Darian answered sincerely, because of what you showed them. It must be because of the investigation incident. The commander of the First Corps killed the previous investigator, but this time I took care of the wounded investigator, called in the demon doctor, and crushed Godden's skull. It was a good move. Darian leaned towards the protagonist and whispered, Master, say a few words to them. The protagonist remained silent, analyzing the faces in front of him. Finally, he spoke firmly. I don't know if you'll be happier or more miserable now that I'm the master of the Nirvana Pavilion, but I am sure of one thing. Your hearts will beat stronger than before. Those present cheered him on enthusiastically, while the protagonist watched the scene calmly. That's just the beginning. In the protagonist's office, he reflected on the warm welcome he had received as the new master of the Nirvana Pavilion. The atmosphere was so good. And you gave me this here to kill me, didn't you, Darian? He said, holding a report in his hands. Darian replied seriously, that was an unfairly handled incident. I thought you'd like to see it. The protagonist frowned, analyzing the contents. Is this related to the Bloody Sky Swordsman? Darian hesitated, but eventually nodded. It coincides with the time and circumstances. There's a good chance he's involved. Leon intervened, worried. This time, you need to hold back Prota. The Bloody Sky Swordsman is not someone to be messed with so easily. The protagonist held out the paper for Leon to take. The stories written here are very unfair. We can't just ignore them because the culprit might explode. Read for yourself. Leon glanced around and muttered in a serious tone. You need to do something about this. In the entertainment pavilion, a drunk man was drowning his sorrows in drink. Another, older man approached. You need to stop drinking. You know your situation isn't going to get any better. The drunk man, visibly shaken, replied angrily, stop drinking. How can I? The people who put my son in a coma for 10 days were acquitted as innocent. The old man tried to calm him down. The Nirvana Pavilion is investigating this. Investigating? The drunk laughed bitterly. They covered it up. They said my son was injured in a duel. He took another sip and continued. I heard that the father of the boy who led the attack is the demon of the 100 swords, a subordinate of the Bloody Sky Swordsman. He leads the 100 swords. The old man was visibly shocked, but whispered, keep it down. You don't want anyone to hear that, do you? The drunk ignored the warning, raising his voice. I don't care if they hear. The Nirvana Pavilion will finish me off or ask the demon of 100 swords to kill me. But if my son doesn't wake up, not even my wife will survive. I'll kill that bastard and then take my own life. Suddenly, a group of armed men appeared in the bar. The leader, a man with a scar on his face, spoke calmly. Do you really think you can kill the son of the demon of 100 swords? The drunk looked at them, confused. Who are you? The leader gave a cold smile. The right question is, who are you? A man who shouts to the four winds that he's going to kill someone's son. The drunk shouted, full of rage, bring my son back. I want his life back. I want an apology. The man with the scar sighed, raising his head. There, it's done. I'm apologizing. Now you can't say I didn't apologize. The silence in the bar was heavy. Then the man with the scar and his cronies started laughing. The drunk, overcome with rage, drew his sword, but before he could attack. The scarred man hit him with a powerful punch, knocking him away. He looked at the others in the bar and declared, "He drew his sword first, didn't he? It was self-defense." His colleagues nodded quickly. "Yes, we saw. It was self-defense." While beating the drunk, the scarred man said, "A simple merchant dares to want to report to the Nirvana Pavilion. Your son was an idiot. They asked him to steal money from his own house, but he didn't want to. He thought that being honest was the best option. Look where it got him." The drunk, even bloodied, raised his voice. "You confessed. You just confessed that it was you who attacked my son." The man with the scar stopped for a moment. He looked around the bar and asked, "Did anyone hear that?" The regulars bowed their heads in silence. The man with the scar smiled, satisfied. No one listened. And then he laughed out loud, while the poor man cried on the floor. The man with the scar laughed, mocking the drunk crying on the floor. A grown man crying like a child, like father, like son. Right before he could continue, a firm voice interrupted the noise. "I heard your confession perfectly." Everyone in the restaurant turned towards the entrance, where the protagonist was standing. His gaze was sharp and his presence imposing. The man with the scar frowned. "Who said that?" When he finally saw the protagonist, he hesitated. The protagonist, however, wasted no time. "You don't have any manners in your mouth, do you? How can such a little child be here?" The man with the scar immediately bowed his head, feigning humility. "I'm sorry. I was very emotional. I didn't mean any disrespect." The protagonist smiled, but coldly. "Of course. That's what you thought I'd say, isn't it?" The man raised his head, confused and angry. "I don't know who you are, but I'm going to end you here and now." The protagonist narrowed his eyes and replied sarcastically, "Being the son of the demon of 100 swords doesn't give you any immunity. But from the looks of things, you're well respected around here, so your father must have quite a reputation, right?" The comment made the scarred man flinch. Before he could react, the drunk, still on the ground, muttered, "Young master." The second young master. Everyone in the bar was shocked, wondering what he was doing there. When the protagonist's identity was confirmed, the man with the scar turned pale. "You." The protagonist crossed his arms. "Today, I am not the son of the celestial demon. Today, I am here as the master of the Nirvana Pavilion." Leon, who was standing next to him, whispered. That might make him even more nervous. The protagonist laughed. "Is that so?" The man with the scar began to mumble apologies, his confidence completely destroyed. "I didn't mean any disrespect. Please don't be angry." But the protagonist remained calm, analyzing him. "You don't seem to regret it. You know exactly when to bow, don't you? Well, it's no use. I'm not letting you go. I'm here strictly to talk to you." The man was terrified. "Talk to me." "Yes, I've come to investigate the attacks you've committed." The man desperately tried to defend himself, but the Nirvana Pavilion has already found me innocent. The protagonist nodded. "Yes, but now I'm the pavilion master. I've reopened the case." He pointed to the man with the scar and listed. "First, extortion. You demand money from people on a daily basis. Second, instigation of theft. You ordered others to steal for you. Third, attempted murder. You beat a boy to death. And now, I see another victim. The father of that boy, whom you beat up in front of me." The protagonist has stepped forward, his presence overwhelming. "On the basis of these crimes, you will be imprisoned for at least 20 years. The man panicked. "It wasn't an attack. We were just dueling." "Oh, you forgot? You've just confessed everything," said the protagonist firmly. "I heard everything." The man with a scar shouted, "My father won't let this happen. He'll want revenge. He'll kill you, even in prison." Before he could finish, the protagonist hit him with a devastating punch to the stomach. The impact lifted him off the ground before he collapsed breathless. Threatening the master of the Nirvana Pavilion already carries a 30-year prison sentence. "You know that, right?" The man was crying and could barely respond. I'm sorry. The protagonist approached and looked at him with contempt. "Enough about your father. Now you have to give me a reason not to arrest him." The man stammered, not knowing what to say. Have you ever done something kind in your life? Have you ever helped anyone?" asked the protagonist. The man remained silent, unable to answer. "You can't think of anything, can you?" continued the protagonist. "Of course I can't. You've never done anything like this. Why should I forgive you? I promise I'll be kind from now on," said the man, crying. The protagonist slapped his face so hard that his nose began to bleed. The whole bar fell silent. Even the drunk was shocked. "You can live like this, but only after you get out of prison," said the protagonist. He looked at the man's accomplices, who immediately raised their hands. "We only did what he told us. We're not to blame." The protagonist smiled coldly. "So you're accomplices too. Let's settle this at the Nirvana Pavilion." The protagonist looked at the scarred man's accomplices and declared firmly, "If you don't want to be arrested, there is one option: plea bargaining. You'll tell everything you know." The accomplices exchanged nervous glances, but nodded quickly. "Yes, we'll tell you everything you want." The protagonist signaled to Darian, "Take everyone to the Nirvana Pavilion." Darian obeyed promptly, and within a few minutes, investigators and guards arrived to escort the criminals to the pavilion. Meanwhile, the entire bar remained silent, shocked by what had happened. The protagonist turned to those present and declared, "Listen up. If anything like this happens again, report it directly to the Nirvana Pavilion. As long as I am the master, no outside influence will determine my judgment." The impact of his words was clear. The restaurant goers were visibly impressed. The protagonist protagonist smiled and added, in an ironic tone, and if any of these kids dare to call their father to sort things out, remember, I can call mine too. The silence was broken by laughter and applause. Everyone knew that he was the son of the celestial demon, and his declaration brought relief and confidence to the place. Leon approached the drunk who was still on the ground, helping him to his feet. The demon doctor took a look at his son, on the young master's orders. The man's eyes widened in disbelief. The what? The demon doctor. He doesn't look after people like us. The protagonist intervened calmly. Your son is more important than you think. The man began to shake with emotion. Is it true? My son. Is he going to be all right? He woke up before we came here. He must want to see you right now, replied the protagonist. The father fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. He bowed his head, sobbing as he said, Thank you, young master. Thank you for saving my son. The protagonist bent down, holding the man by the shoulders. No need to thank me. You've dedicated your life to the demonic cult. It's only natural that the cult protects its own. The man held the protagonist's hand firmly, thanking him from the bottom of his heart. Emotion overtook the place, and even the restaurant owner was visibly moved. The protagonist looked at everyone and, with a genuine smile, said, It's not just mine. This service belongs to all of us. I'm the one who thanks you. If you like this content and want to support the channel, subscribe and become a member. This helps us grow and keep bringing you amazing videos. Click on the button and become part of this community. Become part